A young boy with white hair recalls a memory. On his 5th birthday, he collapsed and had a nightmare. In his dream, a man with white hair similar to his knelt before a black-haired man and a group of women. The white-haired man was breathing hard, covered in blood and wounds. The man raises his sword, an angry and determined expression on his face. He swings it down with all his might and cuts clean down on the white-haired man's neck. The sound of cutting flesh echoes in the young boy's head as he clutches at his own throat. Because of that nightmare, he finally remembered. The world he currently was in was a game he knew very well. And Luke, the white-haired man from the dream and the villain that gets killed in that scene, was the young boy. Luke had loved that game. It was set in a fantasy world full of love and war, intended for adults. The game's protagonist was the man known to be the strongest swordsman, the Sword Emperor, who's currently enjoying his life at the academy at the time the game's story starts. It was a story where he could fall in love and train with his companions to grow stronger, before finally defeating the evil Duke's family planning a coup d'etat, which is basically a rebellion to seize the throne. Luke was the second son of that very same evil Duke. Luke remembers how in the game the original Luke had a terrible nickname, the gross, fat Toad. The Luke from the game messed with the protagonist and his allies like a horrid tyrant while hiding behind his family's authority. People used that nickname to mock his awful appearance and personality. I'm sorry, but I can't blame them. The kid is cute now, but the adult version isn't that great. Since it was a game for adults, there were hardcore scenes too, that the current Luke wasn't able to handle well back when he played the game. I honestly don't want to think, much less know, what those scenes were about. Yikes. The reason given for the original Luke's horrible personality was that his mother died immediately after giving birth to him, and that nobody in his family cared about him. As a result, he did evil deeds to earn his family's recognition. But he neglected his training and developed an inferiority complex. Nothing ever came of his talent for magic he had since birth, and he ended up being used as a sacrificial pawn for the Duke. He didn't even serve as a mid-level boss. His one and only purpose was to be killed off. The young Luke, the one who got sent into the game, now lay sick in bed. Holding out his small hands in front of him, he thinks of how both he and the protagonist are supposed to be 15 when the game starts. With a thoughtful expression, he thinks of the version of Luke he sees in the game and questions if that was how he turns out in 10 years. You looked that old at 15? Bro. Looking out the window, Luke thinks how he didn't want to die. He still had memories from his previous life, so he didn't need his new family to love him. He figures that if he stops himself from becoming the gross fat Toad, his words not mine, and doesn't do any evil deeds, then he might be able to change the future. With a more hopeful and happy expression, he dreams of a future where he can live the rest of his life in peaceful happiness. Luckily, he was a noble, so he won't have to worry about making a living. But his happy expression drops. Luke realizes that he can't change the fact that his family was evil. He won't be able to escape the purge that's coming for them, but he wanted to have enough power to defend himself at the very least. He suddenly remembers that Luke supposedly had a talent for magic. He stares at his hands and concentrates, realizing he can feel some sort of airy, soul-like energy, and wonders if that was mana flowing through him. Imagining a game system screen, he wonders how to use magic without a user interface. He remembers that a magic caster should be able to heal himself, so he presses his hands to his chest and chants for himself to heal. Light softly envelops his body. When the light fades, he wonders if it works since he couldn't really check without a game's health bar. But he did feel a little better. Putting his hands back to his chest, he tries to get even better, chanting for himself to heal over and over, until he eventually tilts sideways and passes out. Before long, sunlight was pouring in through the window. The door to his room creaks open and a voice calls out to him, telling him to get up and asking how he was feeling. A freshly healed Luke slowly wakes up, realizing it was morning. He rolls over in bed, feeling sluggish but no longer ill. He wonders if he lost consciousness because he ran out of mana. He supposed that meant he only had enough mana for 10 heals or so on. 10 heals is plenty for a 5-year-old though. That means he's crazy talented, whoa! A maid comes up to him as he thinks that he wouldn't understand anything unless he takes the time to study magic. His maid wonders out loud if he was still feeling under the weather and helps him change from his pajamas. Luke believes it would be best if he had somebody to teach him. However, his father probably wouldn't give him a tutor even if he asked for one. In that case, self-study it was. Luke calls for Syrup to read him a book. Syrup was the name of his maid, a dog beastman who was currently 12 years old. Wagging her tail, she agrees to his request. Later on, Luke hands her a book on magic fundamentals and Syrup checks with him that he really did want her to read such a difficult book for him. She suggests a picture book instead, holding up one she personally liked called Hakan, the Loyal Dog. Of course not to be confused with Hachiko, the best doggo. Luke replies that he wanted to try to learn how to use magic. With his best puppy eyes, he pleads with Syrup to read it to him. With a face like that, I can't believe that's how he turns out when he's older. His cuteness shoots an arrow straight to Syrup's heart and she agrees. As Syrup sits down, Luke lies down on the sofa with his head on Syrup's lap. She laughs that he really was still a boy. Luke asks Syrup to teach him how to read and do math while she was at it, adding that she was the only one he could rely on. With sparkling eyes, she excitedly tells him to leave it to her. Hyped up, she suggests that maybe they should take the opportunity to start training too. Luke observes that dog beastmen like Syrup have traits similar to dogs, like enjoying exercise. Completely straightforward and with a careless smile on his face, Luke disagrees with her. She loses her earlier excitement at his words, and thus Luke began being taught by Syrup. However, as she reads through the book, Syrup stammers, reading the words the whole time. With a teasing smile, Luke comments how amazed he is that she could read long and difficult words. With tears in her eyes out of embarrassment, she asks if she was really useful, and Luke reassures her that she was. But internally, he thinks that the book may have been too difficult to read. He sums up magic fundamentals from what Syrup read out loud. Mana was a transparent energy floating in the air around everyone. The amount one can use and the power of someone's spells depends on their talent. Luke figured that soul-like feeling in the air he felt while he was sick really was mana. And as expected, it seems like Luke really does have a talent for magic. For casting spells, one could cast a spell simply by imagining and letting their mana flow to where they want it to go. Luke was able to use heal because he imagines his mana healing him. And finally, the difference between attributeless magic and attribute magic was that attributeless magic was basic magic anyone could use, while attributed magic requires a special talent to use. According to the book, most nobles are able to use attribute magic. The de Suctos family, Luke's noble family, had an especially excellent lineage. Luke figured that maybe he would be able to use attribute magic before long. As he continues to listen to Syrup talk, he slowly drifts off to sleep. Syrup takes notice and carries him to bed, tucking him in. Gently caressing his head, she smiles softly and promises to make sure to keep him safe. A year passes. Luke is focusing his mana. The total amount of mana he could use in one day has increased. He found out that he could improve the amount of mana he can store inside his body by using it all up every day. It was really rough when he first started training since he was fainting all the time, which horrified Syrup. As he reads books in the annex library, Luke mourns that it was a pity that he still hasn't been able to find a suitable magic teacher. The annex that he lived in only had a head butler and 3 maids, so there was a limit to what he could learn from them alone. He searches through the library shelves for more books. He learned to read and started studying. Luke was thinking of ways to avoid his fate of being a gross fat toad. First on his list of changes, he had to take care of his health. From how the original and older Luke looked in the game, it was clear that there was a lot that could be improved in terms of health. The Luke in-game had acne, blemishes, warts, cracked skin, was obese, and among other things. Apparently, people in his current world don't bathe and wash their faces daily. That's nasty, not gonna lie. Holding a hand up, Syrup marvels as bubbles clung to her hands. Luke tells her to use the bubbles to wash her face. Luke and Syrup were sitting on the floor of his room in front of basins of water, prepping bubbly soap in their hands. Syrup asks Luke if there was a reason the soap was so foamy, and Luke casually answers that he had delicate skin, so it was to wash it more gently. Syrup pauses in shock. With horror, she exclaims in disbelief that he had delicate skin. Internally, Luke says that Syrup wouldn't know that unless she's seen what he ends up looking like in the future. Carelessly, he tells her that it wasn't a problem right at that moment, so she didn't have to worry about it, but she disagreed. With a content smile, Syrup tells him that as his personal maid, she would learn his routine. Luke shares her soft smile, and thus, the two of them started doing their skincare routine twice a day. Luke wants to be rich enough to use high-class products without worrying about the costs. He wants to be able to buy soap, face lotions, body lotion, moisturizer, and sunscreen. Later on, Luke uses his magic to carry a bucket of water into his bathtub, which has him multitask practicing his magic while getting ready for a bath. While in the bath at the veranda, Syrup complains that she couldn't get used to washing her body like that. Luke lets her know that he was glad that she took the time to learn how, because in a year's time, her skin will be completely smooth, and if she keeps the habit up, he's sure she'll grow up to be quite a beauty. There's a pause between the both of them before Syrup admits that she noticed that Luke's got all kinds of things in his mind. Looking at Luke, who almost seemed to sparkle, she tells him that he even seemed to look much healthier than he used to. Syrup adds that recently, the two of them had even started taking turns cooking. Luke had decided that he needed to change his diet early on. He told the head butler that he didn't need any meals served from then on. The butler was a little flustered, but agreed nonetheless. Luke seemed to always feel awful after eating, using his magic to heal himself at night. He guessed that maybe the dishes from his current world didn't just sit right with him. Ever since he started preparing dishes from his previous world that he thought would be good for him, his health improved. Enjoying his meals, it looked like he didn't have anything wrong with his digestive system. Syrup continues that he stopped sleeping in late every morning. Luke had started getting up early to fix his daily routine, making sure to go outside every day to get some sun. Syrup was happy that he could go outside now. He had started taking walks and doing some light exercise. Syrup tries again to suggest that they start training, but Luke immediately shuts the idea down with a smile. He didn't really like exercising, so much so that it was out of the question. Luke calls out to Syrup, and with a solemn expression, he tells her that he wants to live a healthy, easygoing life. Syrup repeats his words, a worried look to her, and Luke says yes. He continues that he thinks that it'll be quite difficult to live an easygoing life. Syrup asks again, confused, and Luke explains that if he only continues to eat and sleep, he'll become something terrible very quickly. Syrup is surprised and reasons that he was so cute for that to happen, to which Luke agrees, yes bro, earn your cute side. Internally, Luke thinks how he really couldn't imagine how the original Luke turned out like that. He feels like he has a lot of potential, so he'd like to grow up handsome if he could. Luke continues that eating and sleeping all day for every day would also mean he'd have a terribly lot of time on his hands. Syrup asks if he meant because he was a noble, and he answers that leisure isn't leisure if it's all someone does. I know he's supposed to be older internally, but Syrup isn't questioning why this 6-year-old was so philosophical. Luke compares how if someone went to the amusement park or the casino every day, it'd quickly become less fun, and judging how his father treated him, he was going to sacrifice Luke and leave him dead sooner or later. He may have been born a noble, but there was no safety net for him. The original Luke misused his privileged upbringing, leading himself to ruin, but the Luke right now planned on making sure to make the most of it and prepare for the future. Determined, he decides that since his childhood is privileged, he'd like to avoid any unnecessary hardships. After all, he was planning to have a wife support him in the future. And if he couldn't marry, he needed to find a source of income that allows him to live without worries, even if he was on his own. If he could make one choice that would change the course of his future, it would be not going to the Alcides Royal Academy. The Luke in-game as a character mainly appears in the Academy arc of the game after all. The game is split into 2 major arcs. First was the Academy arc, which was focused on romance and training the player's characters, and the second was that war arc, where the player had to resolve the incident caused by the villain. Amazingly enough, this sounds like Fire Emblem Three Houses, and I can say that I understand why Luke loved the game. He strategized that mastering both arcs would be his ticket to getting ahead in life. If he didn't attend the academy, his odds of survival would increase dramatically. And yet Luke still had a reason to attend. He thinks of the game he once loved to play. In the academy, one would be able to find those very same characters, and he loved all of them. Luke smiled in excitement at the idea. He wanted to enjoy his game world as Luke, and by that he meant he wanted to be a happy slacker. Speaking with Syrup again, she gets a sneaky smile to her face as she reasons with Luke that if he wanted to live an easygoing and healthy life, then he should learn swordsmanship. Immediately, Luke shuts down the idea again, putting pressure in his words as he says that he would prefer to move as little as possible. Syrup combs through his hair with a flustered expression, trying to convince him that not only was it fun, but it would also help him protect himself. Internally, Luke smiles at how Syrup really liked the idea of swordsmanship. Luke retorts that he didn't need to learn swordsmanship when he had Syrup. Syrup is surprised, asking him how he found out that she was learning swordsmanship. Luke admits that he just had a feeling. With a content smile, he tells her that he'll leave the sword fighting to her, and Syrup agrees happily. She bids him goodnight and leaves the room. As Luke lay in bed, he thinks about how he knew that he kept refusing every offer she made to exercise, but he reasons with himself that there was no getting around moving around at least a little if he wants to stay healthy. But that was why he invented a new spell. The next morning, Luke steps out of the annex. He raises his hands and a jelly-like substance comes out, forming a large slime. It's so cute and happy. It was an original attributeless magic Luke called Val. His new spell can work while he sleeps. But before someone can understand how Val works, one needs to understand that attributeless magic is basic magic that transforms mana into various forms. It can be mostly divided into 5 major categories. First was daily life magic. Quite self-explanatory, it was magic that helps the user out with daily tasks such as light for illumination and clean for cleaning and laundry. Luke figured that because people in the game world didn't bathe much because the clean spell already existed. Second, there was strength magic. It was magic that uses mana to temporarily enhance attributes like strength, dexterity, or defense. How strong the user can become depends on their original strength, but in exchange, it sacrifices the user's endurance. The effect varies a lot from person to person depending on how well they train their bodies. Just about everyone could use those 2 spells. Third was enchantment magic. This was a special school of magic that enhances the user's weapon with attributes. It was another form of buff magic that only smiths and enchanters could use. Even Luke didn't have an idea how to use it. Fourth was support magic. This school of magic consists of buffing and debuffing other people. The effect's power depends on how well the user can imagine it and how specific it is. For example, Become Strong made someone become physically stronger. Strength in the arms will grow threefold, made mana support the muscles to give someone triple the strength in their arms. To use it, the user has to cover the target in mana to support them. And finally, the fifth one was Restoration Magic. It uses mana precisely to stimulate the body and make it recover. The effect depended on how well the user understands bones, muscles, blood, and the body in general. Thanks to his education in his part life, he was quite good at restoration magic. Let us all be thankful for modern-day understanding of anatomy and physiology. All the attributeless magic schools rely on transforming mana, and that was what Luke used to create Val, a self-sufficient type of spell. Luke thinks of how easy it is to use as he orders Val to fetch a glass of water from a table. Floating over to the glass, Val sucks it up in its jelly-like body and delivers it to Luke. All Luke had to do was give it an order, but now here comes the real test. Sitting down and lying down his head on the table, Luke tells Val that he was leaving everything to it. He lay still on the table as Val stuck itself to him. Luke had ordered it earlier to envelop his body while he was sleeping, and it did so to exercise his body instead of him actually exercising. That's quite the next level of laziness. Work smart, not hard, I guess. Val used his body to run laps, practice martial arts, and do jumping jacks. If Luke can exercise while unconscious, then staying healthy would be a piece of cake. Breathing heavily, Luke takes control of his body once more as Val lets go. Luke gives Val a thankful look, deciding that that was enough for the day. Val smiles at him, proud. He heads back to the annex thinking how wonderful it was that it can move on its own. With this tactic, he can train while remaining easygoing. Luke lay down on the sofa. Unfortunately, he got muscle aches after using Val. He looks to the table beside him, stacked with books. Everything is going well for him, but there is still so much to do. His stomach grumbles. He murmurs to himself that it's still afternoon and he was already hungry. He reasons that he did just exercise and he was still growing. Getting up in a rush, he decides that too much moderation is also a bad thing. He goes to Syrup to ask for dessert and eats it happily, reminding himself that what he was working towards was merely the life of a lazy, villainous noble. It's 5 years later, Luke is 11 years old, and Syrup is 17 years old. While Luke is sitting on a floating cushion, focused on reading a book, Syrup is dutifully standing by his side, her expression rather nervous. Luke mutters words to himself every now and then, fully content in his position, before Syrup hesitantly calls out to him. He snaps out of reading his book and turns to her. With a yell, she asks how he was floating in mid-air. Apparently, Luke had realized there's no real difference between carrying a glass of water and carrying himself, but it would be a pain to explain to Syrup since she's so bad at magic. So instead, he chooses to dodge the question. He asks Syrup if she wants to ride the cushion already sitting up. Syrup asks for permission and Luke grants it. The cushion is lowered and Luke gets off. As Syrup nervously gets on the cushion, he tells her there was no need to be scared, since he was using mana to properly support it. Once she settles in, Val begins rising up into the air. Syrup braces herself, but as she opens her eyes, she has a dazzled expression on her face. She turns to Luke, eyes sparkling as she tells him that she had never experienced anything as comfortable as that before, to which Luke is glad to hear. Syrup raises a hand and brings up the question of how come even though all he does is always reading or sleeping, his body is still so well trained. Luke had grown taller, but Syrup had also noticed when she helped change his clothes, how toned his body suddenly was. He's just 11 at this point? Bro? Luke figured that it was no surprise that Syrup's confused about that as she's only ever seen him take walks. He tells her that he didn't mind sharing how. Syrup helps him into a more comfortable set of clothes and they leave the annex, stepping into open ground. He tells her to watch as he bunches up his mana and solidifies it into a ball, doing so as he explains, before touching his chest. Syrup flinches at the sudden shift in Luke's eyes. A burst of mana comes from him as Val takes control. Val has evolved a lot over the past 5 years. Along with his comprehension of it, he realized something new over the past 5 years of diligent practice. As Val takes control, Luke loses awareness of everything around him, including Syrup's presence. Luke had learned to master martial arts, making a succession of powerful moves, kicking the air and throwing strong punches. Syrup exclaims in amazement. Syrup asks what was going on and how he had said he always hated intense exercise. But Luke doesn't respond, carrying on with his exercises, much to Syrup's confusion. With one final punch, Luke brings his fists back close to him and breathes deeply. He lets out an exhausted sigh before turning to Syrup and asking for her thoughts. Excitedly, Syrup exclaims how amazing he is. She lightly jogs to him, telling him how surprised she is that he was working so hard, but Luke responds that he hasn't really worked hard. Syrup yells, confused, as she reasons that his movements were those of a master. She adds that she's never seen anyone who could move in a similar manner, not even martial arts. Luke laughs at her words. Holding his hand up, he shows her his mana and tells her it was a new spell he's created that he called Trace. He absorbs Val into his body and passes his memories to it directly from his brain. He had it create the movements of his favorite martial arts masters. Though he himself has forgotten the exact movements, Val is able to dig them up and mimic them perfectly. Depending on the title, Val is even able to mix in moves from his favorite fighting games and manga. That's so overpowered, what in the world? All the knowledge he has of fighting styles and their histories ended up being combined into his own personal fighting style. As such, Luke wraps up his explanation that he isn't even conscious about how he moves, so he can't say that he's been working hard. But still, he admits that he gets to train his body to grow stronger. He even gains some muscle memory, so it's quite convenient. Syrup says that the floating spell is amazing on its own, but to even invent another new spell. Syrup tells him that he's a genius, but Luke disagrees. Syrup continues to convince him, saying that he's only 11 years old and has already caught a glimpse of the mysterious abyss that is magic. Syrup is so cute and silly. Luke laughs and tells her he didn't know what she was talking about, but he chalks it up to her saying that she had a hard time understanding. Luke thought it was understandable. After all, he got all the knowledge from his previous life and he still doesn't really understand how it works. Stepping back into the annex, Luke tells Syrup that he was tired from the workout and she offers to prepare a change of clothes for him. But Luke insists on taking a short bath while he was at it, so they head to a spring in the forest. It is the closest source of water they can use to bathe in. Looking at Syrup from his place in the springs, he thinks of how the other maids are always talking about how beautiful Syrup has recently become. She's kept up with the beauty regimen he taught her for 5 whole years, and it feels like her beauty has reached another level. We love a queen with a skincare routine. She's also kept up her swordsmanship training and really polished her fierceness. As Luke steps out of the spring and changes into new clothes, he calls for Syrup, and she immediately comes towards him, wagging her tail. Despite everything she's become, she still acts like a loyal dog who gets overjoyed by Luke simply saying her name. Laughing, Luke thinks that seeing the cute side of Syrup is his special privilege. Their dynamic is so cute. When they're back in the annex, Luke tells Syrup that he has a job for her. He asks for her to tell his father that he wants his magic attribute to be determined, to which Syrup follows through immediately as she steps out of the room. Back in his floating cushion, Luke leans back with a content smile, looking forward to his guest. Attribute magic, where someone can use the attribute they were born with, is called the power determined by God in this game world. If somebody tells a magic user what it is, that user will be able to use their attribute. The Ministry of Magic of Alesidas would be the one to determine it. They manage all attribute spells in the kingdom. It's a place where only the greatest of sorcerers of the world gather, meaning that someone belonging to that elite group will be coming to tell Luke about his attribute, which is a privilege granted to the nobility. Apparently it seems that some people didn't have attributes. But Luke casually leans back with an easy smile, thinking how he didn't have to worry. Even among noble families, the Descustos family all have especially excellent attributes. His stepmother has rock, his older sister has seduction, his older brother has iron, and finally his father has sand. With an excited smile, he wonders what attribute he had. The following day, there was a knock on the door. Luke opens it from his floating cushion, realizing his mistake a second too late. A man enters, exclaiming at the sight of a beautiful girl riding a floating cushion. Luke turns to him, wondering who he was and why he assumed he was a girl. Thinking about it some more, Luke did originally look quite good and he's done his best to maintain his beauty regimen, but he wonders if he really did look that cute. Own your cuteness, Luke. You look absolutely adorable. Syrup comes in and introduces the man to be Malsa Glico, the chief of the Ministry of Magic's Attribute Bureau. Syrup leaves his side to stand beside Luke. Malsa pauses and fixes his glasses before calling out to Syrup, which has Luke on edge. But Malsa happily states how amazing Syrup's memory was, memorizing his entire title despite only hearing it once. He adds that it was to be expected from a servant of the Descustos family, and he commends her again for not slipping up. Syrup proudly replies that it was only natural. Getting down to business, Malsa asks where the young master of the Descustos family was. Syrup turns to Luke and introduces him as Luke Hugelo Descustos. It's my first time hearing his government name and he really does sound like a noble. Malsa apologizes in a panic for being rude. Luke thinks back to Malsa's words and wonders if he really did just praise her. Civil man was anyone who isn't a demi-human, a beast man of the spirit races, or a demon. The state church holds the doctrine of civil man supremacy, which teaches that everyone but the civil people should be scorned. Does that mean Luke being assigned with Syrup is supposed to be another way that he was being disrespected in his own household? That would be crazy. Luke thought for a moment that Malsa would berate her and prepared to take action, but he's sure that Malsa isn't a bad person. He hops off of the floating cushion and heads over to Malsa. Luke calls him Malsan, which is both a good pun and very cute. Holding out a hand, Luke tells him to just call him by name. With a warm smile, Malsa shakes his outstretched hand. They sit down on sofas across from one another as Malsa tells him that they were starting. He asks Luke to close his eyes, and as he does so, Luke hears a sigh of relief. He wonders if Malsa was nervous. Malsa raises a wand. Sleep and sloth. Luke's eyes widened as he heard him say those words. The moment Malsa did so, the attributes inside of Luke came to be. Or it would be better to say that he realized something he'd always known. With a joyful expression, Luke mutters how amazing it was. He tells Malsa that he really does suddenly understand what kind of magic he could use just by saying the attributes. Malsa explains that among attribute magic, there are certain unique ones called rare magic. Both of Luke's attributes would be classified under rare magic. Our boy truly is special in every way. Malsa continues that usually all attribute magic is recorded and made publicly available, but they had a custom of keeping rare magic secret. He asks whether it was fine with Luke if they recorded his abilities simply as magic that influences the human body, to which Luke agrees. Luke asks if there were other ways to utilize his magic since there were only simple ways of using them popping in his head. Malsa answers that everybody has certain spells they're more suited for than others, regardless of attribute. He says that Luke can improve his abilities by researching his attributes and saying that it's the only way to master magic. With a determined smile, Luke tells Malsa that he would keep in mind as he starts training. Malsa smiles at Luke's enthusiasm, but he's knocked out of his thoughts when Luke speaks again. He says that he's quite surprised that appraisal magic was a thing, which makes Malsa flinch. In a panic, he asks how Luke knows about appraisal magic. Calmly, he answers that he thought it was quite obvious with how Malsa just appraised his attributes. Internally, Luke thinks about how since he was a reincarnator, he just figured it was a thing, but now he knew it was supposed to be a secret. Malsa tries to explain, but then he starts choking. Luke orders syrup to get some tea for him. They take a break to enjoy their tea and Malsa comments that it was delicious. Luke comments that it's an herbal tea that's good for the body and Malsa agrees that it helped clear his head. He asks what the tea is called, but Luke reveals that he actually grew the leaves himself, so Malsa wouldn't be able to buy it from a market. Instead, he offers to give him a few leaves to take home. Luke assumes that he should keep the idea of appraisal magic a secret, which Malsa thankfully agrees with. Malsa mentions that he's sure that his daughter will like the tea as well, and Luke asks about her. Malsa tells him that the girl is about his age who really likes magic. Suddenly gaining a sudden burst of energy, Malsa excitedly asks Luke about the spell used for the flying cushion since it was definitely not average magic. Luke pauses and Malsa apologizes for his sudden outburst, but Luke brushes his apology off. Luke proceeds to show Malsa how Val works. A confused Syrup watching them chat. Soon the sun was setting. Malsa thanks Luke for his time, but before he leaves, Luke asks if he could be his tutor. Malsa admits that he personally didn't think Luke needed a tutor, so he asks what Luke really wanted. Luke explains that what he was looking for was someone he could write letters to ask for answers to questions about parts of magic he didn't understand. Malsa clarifies that he wanted to be pen pals, and he smiles, interested in the idea. Luke excitedly asks if he was agreeing. Malsa asks in turn if it was alright for him to ask Luke questions in turn. Luke readily agrees, although stating that he might not be able to answer all of them. And with that, they had a deal. Luke finally had a tutor. Thanks to Malsa, he grew quite knowledgeable about magic. In contrast to attributeless magic, where the user can transform mana freely according to their imagination, attributed spells have certain rules they must follow depending on the attribute. Appraisal made Luke realize his own inherent magic. Inherent magic is what they call the basic spells of their attribute. For example, the beginner spells of fire are Pilot Light to produce a flame, Fireball which tightens and solidifies mana, and finally Fire Arrow to fire the solidified mana. The rest is all up to the user's own knowledge and practice. Luke's attribute Sleep has 3 inherent magic spells too. First is Sleep, which puts a target to sleep. The effect varies depending on the amount of mana the user injects, as well as the target's resistance, so the user can fine-tune it to some degree. Second is Sleep Timer, which allows the user to define the period of sleep through touch. The affected target won't wake up for the designated period no matter what happens. And finally, Sleep Delete, which allows you to forcefully dispel any sleep magic. Magic can be defended against through magic resistance and defensive magic, but if they don't know about it, Luke can put people to sleep before they understand the situation. If he uses Sloth too, he's sure they'd have no idea what's going on. His powers are really scary when you think about it. He can knock you out and stab you and you wouldn't know. Excitedly, he thinks of how both of his attributes are so amazing they might as well be cheats. You got that right, Mr. basically won the magic ability lottery. But if there was a fire arrow, Luke wanted there to be a sleep arrow too. If there was, he would be able to put people to sleep even from a distance. He grins as he thinks about putting a teacher to sleep and being able to skip classes as much as he wants. With the letters from Malsa on his lap, he thinks of the non-ending different spells he wants to experiment with. He gets up and stretches, happy at the thought that no amount of time would be enough to test everything out. Luke continued training hard under Val's guidance. He's gotten into the habit of giving Val control of his body and practicing all morning. It clears his head so he can focus on his magic experimentation. Val leaves his body once more as Luke finishes his daily workout. The moment it does so, Luke's stomach lets out a loud grumble, so he decides to make some food for himself. However, Syrup must have heard him, or his stomach in this case, because she calls out from the annex entrance if he wants her to make him a meal, and he agrees. Luke enters the annex as Syrup heads to the kitchen. Internally, he thinks of how he still cooks for himself with memories of dishes from his last life, him and Syrup taking turns in the kitchen. But although Syrup is perfect at any maid work she does and her meals are perfectly edible, I love that it says edible, not delicious. The food she creates still really lacks attention to detail. If the questionable presentation to them was any sign of it, Luke thinks he'll leave talking about it until later. He can feel his worries growing throughout the years, and he was only 11 years old. He strolls out of the annex again with a towel and change of clothes in hand, wanting to take a bath to wash off the sweat while Syrup prepares his meal. Back in the springs in the forest, Luke hears voices within the forest as he bathes. He surfaces from the water, wondering what was in there when nobody usually comes there. He hears a small voice say that they were about to die all alone in the woods without a soul in sight. Luke internally wonders at her words. Since the place wasn't really dangerous, maybe the child was lost. As he dries off, he calls out to the voice in the forest asking who it was. The figure in the forest flinches, wondering out loud why there were people in the forest. Luke finally decides to enter the forest and peek behind a tree to see the lost child. The girl screams, flustered at the sight of Luke still half naked from his bath. Completely reasonable response. Please go on. The girl continues to spiral in shock, her face completely red as she stammers through her words. Meanwhile, Luke, quite oblivious to the girl's panic, comes to the conclusion that the girl was a guest from one of his sister's tea parties. Apparently, his older sister was inviting noble ladies over to expand her clique. He forgot that the party was being held that day. Calling out to the young lady, he asks her directly if she was a guest of his sister Iris. The girl's expression quickly morphs to adoration at the thought of Iris, before she realizes that Luke implied he was her younger brother. Drying himself off, Luke properly introduces himself, and the girl shrieks. She takes multiple steps back and kneels low, introducing herself as Karen C. Caribbean, daughter of Count Caribbean, 12 years old. I can't believe her name is literally the Caribbean Sea. With a warm smile, Luke comments that he found her funny. She's completely dazzled by his expression. Completely reasonable reaction part 2. Luke kneels down holding out a hand for her to grab as he asks her if she can use attribute magic. They both stand up, Karen saying that she can use magic and she really likes it. Luke asks to see her attribute magic. Leaning down, she lifts her skirt a bit and produces a heart-shaped pouch that produces a ladle. Weird place to keep your stuff, but I'm not about to judge. She continuously pulls out object after object, from a plate of vegetables to plates and other cutlery. As she's doing so, she awkwardly tells Luke that she'll show him his magic shortly, so she asks him to put some clothes on first. Leaving to do just that, Luke thinks of Karen's pouch. His curiosity piqued at how it seems to be a magical pouch that can store a ton of things. Karen raises her knife as she tells him about her attribute magic. Her magic was cooking. She cuts through vegetables at a quick yet precise pace, mixing and cooking with skill before topping them off with seasonings. Tasting her creation, Karen makes a satisfied expression. Plating off the dish, she presents a spiced moon rabbit soup she prepared with only ingredients she had on hand. Luke, now fully clothed, takes out a spoonful of the soup, relishing how it smelled delicious and wondering what's different about food cooked with attribute magic. He takes a mouthful and completely stops, his eyes growing wide, internally exclaiming how crazy delicious it is. To best describe it, it felt like he went through a religious experience. He takes scoop after scoop, amazed that he's never had anything so tasty before, not even in his past life. Karen watches him eating excitedly with a proud expression on her face. Suddenly, Luke stops short again. He stares at an empty plate. He could have licked the dish clean with how much it was sparkling. Placing a hand on his stomach, he gets a confused look on his face. What's more to the soup, he could feel power welling up inside him. He came to the conclusion that it was able to buff magic as well. Karen was a young noble lady capable of cooking buffing dishes. Seeing her in a new light, Luke comes to the great conclusion that she's the greatest possible asset to support the slothful life he's aiming for. He excitedly decides that he isn't letting her get away. Calling for Karen's attention, he slides to the end of the table close to where she sat and asks charmingly if she would cook the soup for him every day when they grew up. Oh, this sneaky little man. Karen's eyes widened in shock. With an even more charming smile, Luke asks her to marry him right then and there. OMG? Internally, Luke is resolute and will happily marry into Karen's family. He figures she'd support him even when his family eventually gets crushed. And above all, he needed her incredibly tasty cooking. With completely dazzled eyes, she exclaims in excitement that Luke has just proposed to her. That day, Luke had a miraculous encounter. Later on, back in the annex, he has Syrup contact his father after his meeting with Karen to have the proposal made official, but all his father sent was message for Luke to do as he liked. Luke thanks Syrup for delivering the message, but internally he thinks of how his father really didn't have any interest in him at all. Eventually, everything proceeded swiftly and soon the families were arranged to meet. As Luke steps out of his carriage, Count Caribbean Karen's father greets him warmly to his restaurant. Luke replies with a greeting of his own. They enter the restaurant and Luke tries to apologize for his father not joining the marriage talks, but Count Caribbean reassures him that Duke des Custos dropped by, gave his greetings, and left right after. Count Caribbean invites Luke to take a seat at a dining table. Internally, Luke is rather in disbelief that the head of a high-ranking noble family isn't attending the marriage meeting of his own son, but he doesn't quite mind. Looking at Karen's soft demeanor, he was worried that the Duke might have been too intimidating for her. They sit around the dining table and Luke opens the conversation by stating that since he was only the second son, all he can offer is himself. So he asks if it would be okay if he married into the Caribbean family. Bro, no matter how lazy you are, you're still a walking powerhouse and that's more than anything you can offer. With a bright smile, Count Caribbean replies that the family would be glad to have him. He excitedly adds that Karen had already said that she really loves him, much to Karen's embarrassment. Her face falls, and without looking at Luke, she asks him if he was sure that it was okay for him to marry someone like her. Suddenly panicked, Count Caribbean says that although he heard that Luke was the one to propose, some girls mock Karen for her appearance, so he was worried about that. Luke puts two and two together. Count Caribbean was talking about Luke's older sister Iris, who, at 12 years old, would question other young girls' appearances. Apparently, she treats everyone except her favorite pretty girls very harshly. Casting a glance at Karen, Luke observes that she certainly is a little chubby, but reasons that she's still developing. He adds that he actually found her round face rather cute. Luke, you're starting to sound sus. With a joyful laugh, Count Caribbean tells Luke that he was truly grateful that there was a boy like him who chose Karen for her inner beauty. Internally, Luke says sorry, though he wasn't sorry. He didn't want to marry her because she was a good person, but what drew him in was her cooking and status. He thinks of the soup Karen made him for the first time, a blissful expression on his face. He's snapped out of his thoughts when Count Caribbean starts to talk about his family. Apparently, everyone goes to sea frequently. I love that the family named after the Caribbean Sea are regularly at sea. He observes that it looks like Luke's quite weak to the sun and asks if he'll be alright. The Caribbean family started as fishermen and traders. They're a family that handles a wide array of maritime businesses. Because Karen didn't have any brothers, Luke would end up inheriting the house, but if she later gets a little brother, Luke decided he'd gladly give up the position to them. The idea of just opening up a restaurant with Karen's cooking skills was a nice thought for Luke. He finally turns to Count Caribbean and lets him know that he trains, so he should be sturdier than he looks and, with a proud expression, he states that his countermeasures against the sun are in perfect order, so there was no need to worry. Said countermeasure was actually sunscreen. Luke also figures that he could just summon Val on the ship and then just go to sleep. That way he wouldn't get seasick and he could use it to carry luggage for him. Count Caribbean stands up, giving Luke and Karen time to talk. Luke calls Count Caribbean father-in-law, and with a joyful laugh and wave goodbye, the Count jokingly says that Luke was being quite hasty as he exits the room. With just the two of them now, Karen calls out to Luke and tells him that she wants to be pretty enough to stand by his side. Confused, Luke reasons that Karen was quite cute already, much to Karen's embarrassment. She exclaims that Luke was a boy, but he was so pretty. She continues that she overheard that he's been caring about his appearance and health ever since he was little. Luke notices Karen saying she overheard it. He can only think of one person who would tell her that, and that would be his sister Iris. She always looks like she couldn't care less about him at home, but it seems like she was keeping an eye on him. Karen tells Luke that she'd like his help to grow beautiful too. Luke tells her that he'll gladly help, but he was rather strict as a teacher. Determined, Karen says that she was prepared to learn. She asks him if someone like her can also be beautiful, and Luke tells her that she can, and that is actually a very easy way. If Luke uses sleep and Val together, he would be able to easily make her diet, but he knew that getting thin was the only thing she wanted to have. However, he decides that that wasn't the right time to teach her everything. Luke asks if they can go someplace else. Later on, they end up in his room. Luke orders Syrup to make sure that nobody was spying on them. Although he may be overreacting, Luke was rather worried about his older sister after hearing what she's been up to. Calling for Karen's attention, he immediately jumps into business and tells her that his diet method uses magic, specifically to exercise while sleeping. Karen says it sounds difficult, but Luke explains the process to her. He tells her that he had sleep and sloth attributes, and that for the diet, he'll be using sleep for it to work. He summons Val as he explains that he'll combine it with the attributeless magic spell. Luke uses sleep to make Karen fall asleep and have Val enter her body, after which she will perform a set of copied movements using her body. Luke absorbs Val to show her a demonstration. He sets up sleep timer for 1 minute and orders Val to show her a light workout. A minute later, Luke lets out a breath from exhaustion. He asks for Karen's thoughts on his martial arts and she replies that it was amazing. Luke continues that even still he had no memory of the actual workout. Damn, I wish I had that too. Karen nervously asks if she's able to do that too, and Luke replies that all she had to do was let Val handle the rest. He encourages her to try it and she agrees. Sometime later, Syrup helps Karen change into more comfortable clothes. While she does so, Luke asks Karen if she was good at exercising. She replies rather sadly that she was bad at it, which is very relatable. She peeks behind the room divider with a hand over her muscles, telling Luke that she was quite strong. Luke suggests a light exercise first so her body could get used to it. An hour later, Luke greets her with a good morning and asks how she was feeling. Lying down on a sofa, she cracks her mouth open before stammering out that she was exhausted, sweat pouring from her face. She couldn't believe that what she did was just a light exercise. Oh, this poor child. She squirms on the sofa, her whole body in pain and unable to move. Luke comes forward and uses healing magic. While he does so, he recommends that they stick to basic exercises for the meantime so she can build her stamina, although she'll still feel some muscle pain. With a smile on his face, Luke tells her to hang in there, and Karen, with tears in her eyes, replies shakily that she'll do her best. I can already tell these two are going to be a riot as a married couple. As Karen gets up and stretches her body, Luke starts explaining his beauty regimen. He holds up a bunch of soap and to foam it real good. Karen asks if it can even wash away dirt if it's all foamy, but Luke reassures her that the soap will absorb the dirt. He warns her not to rub it on too harshly or it'll hurt her skin. Karen follows his instructions, making sure to rinse her face properly and remembering to take care that she doesn't brush against her face whenever she touches it. After that was makeup. Karen was brimming with curiosity and quick on the uptake, so Luke found it satisfying to teach her. Finally was nutrition. Luke tells her that since she was good at cooking, she can just use the right ingredients, and he was sure that she could make some delicious food perfect for dieting. Karen found the idea interesting. From then on, Karen got addicted to developing new diet dishes. Karen took all his food ideas and turned them into dishes in an instant. She was even able to replicate Japanese cuisine. Luke was happy. He thought he'd never get to enjoy the same taste in his next world. However, Luke wore an awkward smile as he stared at the feast in front of him. Karen had made way too much. Rather guilty, Karen admits that there were just so many dishes she wanted to try making. Luke tells her that no matter how healthy the food was, it still wasn't healthy to overeat. Karen tries to reason that she couldn't throw the food away either. Without really thinking about his words, Luke suggests that they donate the food to a nearby orphanage. Karen claps her hands in excitement, thinking she can research her cooking and give anything they couldn't finish to the orphanage. She loves the idea, but Luke isn't too keen about it. He honestly looks like he hates it. Since then, Karen tried making even more dishes and took turns distributing them at different orphanages every day. Luke asks if she was going to an orphanage again that day, and Karen smartly replies that he was the one that gave her the idea. Luke tags along, but the entire time he's thinking of wanting to laze about at home. As they enter the orphanage, he observes that they were rather unhygienic, so he couldn't get used to them. Not to mention that even if someone used clean, it still wouldn't completely clean the building, and there are many orphans who can't use magic and thus couldn't clean themselves. The orphans come rushing towards them, or more like towards Karen, but another orphan calls for Karen desperately. Bowing low, she begs for help because her brother fell down and wouldn't wake up. Karen wants to help, but unfortunately doesn't know any healing magic. The orphanage is managed by the church, but the priests show up only when it comes to money. Internally, Luke comments how he really didn't like the church in his world. Forced to help, he tells the orphan to lead him to her brother. Once they enter the room, Luke realizes that it wasn't a place for a sick person to get their rest. He leans over the orphan boy and observes that his breathing was shallow, most likely from a case of pneumonia. Luke holds a hand over the boy, imagining his breathing returning to normal. His hand glows with light, and after it fades, the boy looks healthier than before. Luke steps aside, letting the orphan girl know that he should be fine. The girl collapses next to her brother, thanking Luke over and over. With a terrified look, she turns to him and asks how much his treatment will cost. But Luke brushes her question away, much to the girl's confusion. Luke explains that since he was the son of a duke, he wasn't in any need of money and just healed the boy to practice his magic. A little cold-hearted, not gonna lie, but at least he's honest and still healed the kid. Small wins, I suppose. Luke continues that now. He knew how to heal that specific illness, so he should be the one to thank her. She softly asks him again before bursting into tears and bowing once more. Luke finds the girl clever, sure that she'd have a much easier life if only her surroundings were a bit better. Luke calls to Syrup and casually states that since the Duke had more money than he knew what to do with, what was stopping them from using some of it? Syrup smiles at his words and they head to the office of the orphanage director. Luke drops a whole pouch filled with 50 gold coins on the table of the orphanage director to the older man's surprise. Luke states that the gold should be enough to get hygiene under control and to start teaching the kids. The director tries to interject, but Luke cuts him off and says that he found thinking to be quite the hassle. So the director wasn't allowed to refuse. Now that's what you call a power move. He's still 11 at this point, that's crazy. Finally, the director agrees. Internally, Luke is happy at this turn of events. He had just come to tag along at the orphanage but ended up with something interesting. The orphanage would provide him many opportunities to test out his healing magic. Luke, now 14 years old, sits on his cushion suspended on air by Val. He's enjoyed the past 3 years since he's been engaged to Karen. Syrup takes care of most things for him, Karen cooks for him every day, and he's kept using Val for his beauty and health. Oh, he's definitely living the lazy life, he just wears his pajamas everywhere. He's experienced many things thanks to Karen, but his happy days with her are approaching their end. Karen will start attending the academy and will have to live in the dorms that spring. As such, he wanted to spend as much of what little time they had left together as possible. He turns to his bedroom door, which remains closed. She still wasn't there yet. He jumps off the cushion and decides to go after her, already having an idea why she was late. At the main house, Luke stops walking as he comes across his older brother, Testa, currently 19 years old, and first son of the Disgustus family. Luke's surprised that Testa was around that hour, which was a rare occasion. Testa passes by him, ignoring him as usual. Luke casts him a glance as he walks past, thinking how he was already taller, and yet Testa didn't care. Luke smiles as his focus goes back to Karen, sure that she was at a certain pavilion. Luke steps into the garden and finds Karen. Her diet's been a great success, and she's now regarded as a beauty well known for her appearance and femininity. Rightfully so, she looks absolutely pretty, OMG. Luke comes closer and greets his older sister. With a brushback of her hair, Iris greets him and asks what he was doing there. He responds that he was going to borrow Karen, and Iris gets an annoyed look on her face. She darkly asks if he was trying to break up her tea party, and Luke reasons that she originally came to the estate to visit him. Luke tells her that he just came to the pavilion to take back his kidnapped fiancée. With a light blush on her cheeks, Iris stares Luke down. Apparently, all men who meet Iris's eyes end up wanting to become her playthings. However, it doesn't work on Luke at all. Their stare down ends with Iris losing. Karen calls for Luke's attention and stammers that she also wanted to talk with Iris, apologizing afterwards. In Luke's eyes, he preferred the way Karen looked to his sister. Luke takes a seat beside Karen, reassuring her that it wasn't her fault. Casting a glance at his sister, he asks her if she hasn't had enough fun. Karen is stuck in between them as the siblings argue. Iris looks away, her face hidden behind her fan, and yet the blush on her cheeks is obvious. She urges Luke to leave them alone and that he'll be able to talk with Karen as much as he wanted in the academy. Luke tells her she was being unfair, and reasons that he won't be starting until he goes to the academy the following year, so he couldn't want until then. Karen blushes as she says that two beauties are fighting over her. You deserve the attention with how cute you are. Internally, Luke compares how cute Karen was when she was flustered, while Iris remained stubbornly sulking. Deciding he had no choice, Luke gets up and leans towards Iris. He lightly tells her that she was ruining her beautiful face with the scary look she had on, and with a charming smile, he tells her to do her best in the academy. Iris's face is completely red as she stares dumbfounded at Luke. Luke, I think you did too much of a number on her. Luke holds out a hand for Karen to take. Internally, he's thinking that since he didn't get to see Iris too often, it might be good to earn some points with her. Karen takes Luke's hand, and still slightly flustered at the sudden need to leave, she says goodbye to Iris. However, Iris is breathing deeply, thinking about the expression on Luke's face from earlier. Ayo? She blushes, a small smile on her face, as she thinks how he was the only man whose beauty could match her own. A bit narcissistic, ain't she? Iris decides that she wants him. Ayo sis? That's your younger brother? A few months later, Luke is lying down in bed. Syrup asks him what book he would like to read that day. As Luke is thinking, his thoughts drift to Karen. She's already left for the academy, so there was no need for him to go outside anymore. Syrup was always the one who did the shopping, and whenever he wanted something, Luke could just call for merchants to come to him. He didn't have any friends other than Malsa, so there was nobody for him to meet. And then his thoughts paused. He sits up with a smile and informs Syrup that they are going out. Syrup comments that it was rare that he wanted to go outside and she hoped that it wouldn't start raining. Luke asks her to come with him even if it does start raining. Syrup agrees and still grins at the idea of how rare it was for him to want to go outside first. Later on, a carriage speeds down the road. Syrup wore a cloak to hide her ears and tail as she drove the carriage. From inside the carriage, Luke thinks about how Syrup was good at driving, but then he remembers that she used to take him and Karen to all kinds of places. As a final thought, he sadly thinks of missing Karen. Why are they so cute? Syrup cuts off his thoughts as she announces their arrival. Getting off the carriage, Luke comments that they got to their destination, and Syrup responds that it was because of the status carried by their ducal carriage. Internally, Luke celebrates his invisible authority. Damn, he even has free passage on the streets like an ambulance. That's crazy. Luke looks up at the building before them, wondering if he would find what he came there for. The Great Mido Shop. It's a huge department store that also appears in the game he played. Players could find most things there, from items to equipment and even presents for the love interests. As they enter the building, Luke glances back to Syrup and tells her that she could buy whatever she wanted, to which she thanks him. A man greets them at the entrance. Already knowing his identity, the man introduces himself as Morsky Mido, the owner of the business. At the VIP room, Morsky invites Luke to take a seat and tells him not to hesitate to ask for anything, staff standing in attention and ready to serve him. Morsky then says that Luke might find it boring to deal with an old man like him, so he introduces his daughter to help him as a young girl walks in. Luke excitedly exclaims in his head as the girl enters. She introduces herself as Akari Mido. Akari is one of the main love interests of the game. If the player chooses her, they'll go down the merchant route. Luke introduces himself, and Syrup and Akari greets them both with respect, much to Luke's relief. He sits down, surprised that instead of just getting a glimpse of her, she ends up hosting them completely. Akari asks him what he was looking for, and Luke asks to see anything she could recommend, especially for his beauty regimen. Bro was locked in on looking as pretty as possible. Akari excitedly claps her hands together, proceeding to show what they had for sale. First introducing a magic hairdryer, Akari followed Luke's requests with a smile. She introduces him to one thing after the other, adding some light and witty talk in between. He ended up getting good merchandise, and by that it meant he bought almost everything Akari offered. Luke excitedly turns to Syrup and asks if she wanted anything, but she answers that she wanted nothing. Internally, Syrup thinks of how rare it was that they went shop together, so she wishes that he'd give her something as a present. Luke watches her carefully, but Akari gets up to get something. She takes out a box containing a red choker. Immediately, Syrup's eyes seem to sparkle at the sight of it, but then she stops herself, muttering that she was just a servant. However, without hesitating, Luke tells Akari that they were going to take it. Syrup turns to Luke in a panic. Akari hands the box over to Luke. He turns to Syrup and tells her to take it as thanks for always taking care of him. With a slightly worried expression, he asks if he was wrong to assume that she liked it. Syrup accepts with a smile. Luke clips the collar on her neck and asks what she thought. Happily looking at herself in the mirror, she says that it was wonderful. It suits her so much. Akari excitedly agrees. Calling out to Luke, Syrup turns and asks for what he thought. Luke pets her cheek and tells her that it suited her beautiful white hair. Syrup is pleased with his words and grins while Luke wears a similar happy smile, glad that she likes his gift. As Luke sits back down on the carriage, Akari thanks them for paying a visit. Luke finds the trip satisfying and decides that maybe doing similar activities every now and then wouldn't be a bad thing. After all, he has to leave home and go to the academy by the following year, so he had to experience the world outside a little before then. Not only that, but he wants to resolve himself before leaving home and face the reason the original Luke ended up as the gross fat toad. I make jokes about the original Luke a lot, but no one is more traumatized by him than the current Luke. He changes clothes and lays back down in bed. He already has a good guess on why the original Luke ended up that way, but he still has to face it. He frowns, thinking what a pain it was that the slothful path really is difficult. There was something that always bothered Luke, and that was the original Luke's face and figure. Luke couldn't understand how he turned out like that. It was hard to imagine given how he looked right now. Staring at his own reflection, Luke thought how he started off so well put together. Is a hedonistic lifestyle really all it took to go from the current Luke to the so-called toad in the game? Luke suspected that the food of the game world wasn't suitable for his body, but that didn't seem to be the case. The ingredients are the same. Luke also looked into the possibility of allergies or a weak constitution, but despite all that, he still hasn't come up with an answer. He contemplated food preparation and ingredients before he got the brilliant idea of asking Karen. As such, his first source was Karen. Based on Karen's letter, she says that the ingredients with the properties he describes are almost exclusively toxins. Luke keeps reading the letter. Apparently, they can be used medicinally, but depending on the methodology, it can alter bodily processes or even produce lethal effects. Luke frowned. In that case, it might be able to explain a bizarre change in appearance. He thought it was worth looking into. His second source of information was Syrup. She repeats Luke's question, which was what he was like when he was little. She answers that until he was 4, he ate and slept a lot. He was a cute child. Completely agree. He was a tiny angel. Luke asks if there was anything off about him physically, but Syrup tells him that besides when he said he had delicate skin, he was completely fine. Syrup continues it was that reason why she was so surprised when Luke collapsed. All the other maids in a frenzy. With a joyful expression, a young Luke had been so delighted while enjoying his birthday dinner up until then. Her head lowers as she says that his condition was unstable for about a year, making Luke remember that he ran out of mana and collapsed a lot around that time. Syrup concludes that he only got better around the time he was 6. Luke asks who prepared his meals for him back then, and Syrup answers that they used to have a chef, but he was forced to retire after the birthday dinner, then the steward took over after that. Coming to a conclusion, Luke figures out that the head steward was the one who poisoned his meals. He finally found his answer. Later on, Luke closes the curtains and turns to a chair in the middle of a room. Sat in the chair, blindfolded and gagged, was the head steward. Luke greets him calmly. He begins by saying that he's been doing quite a lot of thinking. Much to the steward's confusion, Luke goes about saying why the original Luke was known as the gross fat toad, and if he had grown up normally, he should have never gotten to that point. With a cold look to his face, he thanks him for making Luke's food every day, but unfortunately, it never quite seemed to agree with him. He summons Val and takes a comfortable seat. The food most likely didn't work for him because there was someone trying to poison him. The steward flinches before trying to explain himself, but he remains gagged, his words muffled. With his magic, Luke rips the blindfold and gag from the steward's face. Immediately, the steward reasons in a panic that he was assigned by the Disgustos family head or Luke's father. Luke walks closer to the steward. He figures it must have been hard for the steward when Luke refused to die and ended up getting even healthier. Luke guesses that no one cared enough to get their hands dirty, not to mention that no one knew that he could use healing magic or that he was neutralizing the poison with it the whole time. He asks directly if the steward was the one poisoning his food, and with a shaking voice, the older man apologizes in fear. Luke is surprised that he admitted to it so quickly. He found his response boring. He would have been more eager for revenge if the steward put up more of a fight. That's cold, Luke, damn. Luke states that he'll forgive the man and he picks up his head with hope. But then Luke raises an arm. He would forgive him only after a little punishment. The steward tries to step back in fear, but Val locks his wrists into place. Luke tells him that he won't kill him, he'll just be his test subject for his magic. He summons a magic circle. The steward is enveloped by magic as Luke grants him the gift of sloth. The steward's stressed face slowly relaxes. Luke thinks aloud to himself with curiosity, seeing sloth used on a person for the first time. He tells the steward to go back to work. Luke walks away, not clear to him that his enemy is Duke Disgustos. The Duke probably won't care if he fires service workers like the head steward, but if Luke ends up provoking the Duke's hostility, he'll be in all sorts of trouble. In that case, Luke decides to incapacitate the Duke's pawns, powerless, but still alive. As he arrives back in his room, Syrup asks where he went off to. Luke collapses on his cushion. With a charming smile, he asks if she would be happy if he was going to the academy. Syrup asks, confused if he was planning on not to because she assumed he was attending. For Luke, there was a good chance that he'll be killed at the academy, so not going was a plausible choice. Luke pets Syrup's cheek as he tells her that his path forward has always been decided and he wouldn't be with her anymore if he went, so he was still thinking about it. Syrup leans into his touch, stating that if it was possible, she would be happy to remain by his side. Internally, Luke thinks that as long as his house is no longer safe, he has no choice but to move if he wants to protect his life of leisure. I gotta respect the consistency of chasing his dream. Luke plans to help the protagonist from the shadows, set the table for the conflict between the royals and the nobles, and just like the game, he'll crush Duke Disgustos, the leader of the nobles. It should be the easiest path with the highest survival rate, but the fact that this is the world of a game he loves hasn't changed. He was realizing again what a difficult character he's been reincarnated as, but he hopes that afterwards he'll still have a sense of satisfaction. Luke's dedicated to playing the role of the character Luke for all it's worth. He smiles, he isn't about to sit back and let himself be killed. Time passes and it's 1 year later. Syrup bows as she wishes for a 15-year-old Luke to take care of himself as he steps away from his carriage. This boy grows up so fast I'm close to being emotional. He enters the Royal Academy's entrance exam grounds. The entrance exam involves 3 tests: magic, practical, and the examinee's subject. Apparently, the top performers in each subject are granted scholarships regardless of their identity. Luke wasn't planning on standing out, so he wasn't going to work too hard. Beside him, an examinee asks out loud about a nearby beastman. Luke wonders if they were taking the practical exam. The beastman's appearance catches Luke's attention. They were a beastman with green hair and emerald green eyes. She was one of the heroines, adventurer Ruby. Making quick zigzag jumps, Ruby rushes in to draw closer to her enemy. Her opponent is caught by surprise. He throws a punch, but Ruby easily dodges and quickly flips to deliver a kick up her opponent's chin. I can't believe they're supposed to be 15 years old. They can kick ass way too good. The powerful constitution of a beastman combined with such unorthodox techniques. Before he can finish watching the fight, a hooded figure calls for his name. He steps forward as the man asks if he really uses magic. Luke summons magic in his hand, annoyed. With a wave of his hand, he sends a powerful magical hit that destroys a large part of the grounds. Ruby watches, amazed, as she holds a dagger to her kneeling opponent. Her opponent has yielded. Ruby's eyes sparkle as she watches Luke. The hooded figure tells Luke that he's done enough and calls for the next examinee. Ruby lets out one more smile, interest piqued. After that, she strolls out of the exam grounds. Luke looks around, checking to see where Ruby went, but eventually giving up since they'll most likely see each other at school. Walking away from the exam grounds, Luke thinks of how the original Luke had excellent grades and incredible exam results in the game, so he didn't have a need to worry about failing. The next day, Syrup holds up a letter. They open it, Syrup's face excited as they read that Luke was accepted into the academy. Finally, Luke's adult romance strategy simulation is beginning. Luke knows he's the one saying it himself, but he's beautiful. He stands before a full-body mirror and strikes different poses. A normal school uniform shouldn't look that good on a person. He's never seen such a perfect and beautiful man before. Can't even call it narcissistic because he really does look pretty, actually. Syrup comes up behind him and informs him that his carriage was ready. Luke thanks her. This is the day his new life starts. The Alcides Royal Academy he's going to attend is the oldest and most prestigious in the kingdom. In the original game, it's the stage where all kinds of ideas and motives intersect. Almost all nobles attend this school, like his older siblings and Karen. Recently, it has also started accepting the most talented commoners. It's begun to recruit more and more students. In the academy, you learn 3 major things: battle, magic, and study. There are many dungeons in the kingdom. Monsters tend to pour out of them all the time too. That's why learning proper self-defense against these threats is considered part of someone's essential education. If it's proper education, kind of crazy that only the best are welcomed into the academy besides some commoners that passed. The academy is also part research facility. It especially focuses on magic development. Luke thought it'll be interesting to have legendary mages as teachers. In the original game, the Academy arc serves 2 main purposes. One is raising the character's stats. If the player is aiming for a particular route, they'll have to manage what flags they trigger carefully. For context, flags are sort of important moments in a game that help lead you to a certain ending. A player should be extra aware of these if they want a very specific ending. The other purpose in the Academy arc is interacting with the love interests. The story and what characters the player can meet will change depending on their stats. Luke's planning on supporting the protagonist using knowledge from his previous life while playing the role of Luke, the villain that's always nearby. He needs to avoid the normal routes where the original Luke dies, although it may already be set to develop differently to the game since he's no longer the fat, ugly toad he was supposed to be. Thinking of Syrup and Karen, Luke is resolute in surviving for their sake. Syrup asks him if he remembered everything for his departure, and Luke replies excitedly that she had prepared everything for him already. Syrup gloomily admits that she was worried. With tears in her eyes and slight anger, she mourns that she wanted to join Luke and clean his dorm for him and be his attendant if only the academy didn't have such strict rules. Apparently, attendants may not differ in age from their student by more than 2 years. I honestly forgot that their age difference wasn't like 2 years or something. Her sense of duty has only grown over the years. The academy allows students to have attendants since many can't care for themselves on a daily basis. But Syrup is 7 years older than Luke, so bringing her is unfortunately out of the question. Holding her hands to comfort her, Luke tells her that he would have been happy for her to come with him too, but it couldn't be helped. Syrup sadly admits that she knew. It's common for young children to have an attendant of similar age for that reason, but Luke didn't have anyone like that. She admits that she was worried about whether the attendant the Duke assigned to him will be able to do a proper job. But again, he reassures her that it'll all work out. Syrup continues that he always goes at his own pace. Luke tells her that he'll be able to take care of himself, and adds that Karen was also at the academy. Embarrassed, but sad all the same, Syrup tells him that she wanted to take care of him. Luke is touched. He raises their hands up to his lips and thanks her wholeheartedly. Syrup has watched over him ever since he was little. His family never showed him any love or affection, but she more than made up for it. He thinks of all the times she had read to him when he was still a child. To him, she's his one and only family. She's always been his exclusive attendant. But recently, she's been taking care of him more and more to the point she's doing everything. So maybe the days without him are going to be harder on her. Calling out to her, Luke pulls on her waist and brings her close to him. Luke hugs her warmly and tells her that she's done more than he could even repay. Syup's tail stands on end from embarrassment. Luke promises to reward her someday. He presses their foreheads together and asks her to believe him and wait for him to come back. Hugging him back tightly, she agrees. Close to tears, she tells him that she was going to miss him, and Luke says the same. Their relationship is so soft. Later on, Syrup and Luke are sitting on his floating cushion. He promises that he'll have a chance at the end of the year to return to the annex, so he asks her to endure it until then, and she agrees. Luke pats her head and asks her to take care of the house for him while he is gone. Syrup tells him that she'll be counting down the days until he returns. He and Syrup wouldn't be together for a little while, but he thinks that he wants to treasure Syrup after his time at the academy comes to an end and forevermore. That's sweet and all, but why does that sound like an incoming death flag in the horizon? With a happy grin, Luke orders for her to come with him once he graduates and leaves the territory with him. I am genuinely terrified that they are being too happy. Syrup asks if he was being serious, thinking that she had nothing to do afterwards. But Luke promises to never let her go. Syrup excitedly replies that she feels the same. Luke suddenly says that if it was fine with Karen, he wanted all of them to be a proper family. Syrup blushes before agreeing. Internally, Luke thinks how cute she is when she fawns over him. He truly loves her, and I'm truly scared for them. And now, it was time for the next chapter in Luke's life. Syrup calls out to Luke as he enters the gates. She gives him one last bow, at least for the meantime, and tells him to have a nice stay. Luke grins at her one more time, waving goodbye. Luke arrives in the academy's main street. Near the dorm reception, Luke thinks about how he was supposed to meet fellow new students, but instead he was being tailed by a girl. She asks how to refer to him, and Luke politely asks if they've met before. Confidently, the girl says that she immediately knew who he was from the description his father gave. She apologizes for the late introduction. She was the daughter of Baron Malsa Glico, the director of the Ministry of Magic. Her name is Libera Glico. With a grin, Luke recognizes her as Malsa's or Malsan, as he called his pen pal and tutor daughter. The only parent of a love interest he knew was Morsky, father of Akari. But now he found the sudden connection interesting. Luke's been on guard because she's the attendant his father arranged, but this changes things. Libera tells him to just call her by her name instead of using any honorifics. Shifting the subject, Luke remembers that she liked anything to do with magic since that was what Malsa said. Excitedly, she replies that she loves magic, even saying that she wanted to get a job at the Ministry of Magic in the future. But slowly, the smile on her face fades as the words leave her lips. Luke assures her that he knows she'll be able to do it. Surprised, Libera tells him how people usually just make fun of her when they hear a girl wants to join the Ministry of Magic. Luke is confused because he thinks she's talented and she worked hard at magic, so he reassures her again that he thinks she'll be fine. With a grin and a blush on her face, she thanks him for his kind words. Shifting the topic once more, Libera states that she'll be taking care of him as his personal attendant from then on, but Luke brushes her off, telling her that he can take care of himself just fine. But Libera continues to push him, saying that she wants to take care of him and that she wants to be closer to him. Luke wonders why she needs to be so close to him, but when he hears Libera say that she found his magic to be an art form, he realizes why. He remembers that Libera was a magic maniac. In the original game, Libera is a witch the player encounters when they raise their magic stat. She's called a witch because her love of magic goes too far and it often leads to trouble. Luke decides to change the subject. He tells her that they'll get around to talking about magic later. First, they need to finish the dorm application, but Libera cuts him off and assures him proudly that it was already over and done with. After all, she couldn't bother him with paperwork. Luke pauses, thinking that she was being too enthusiastic. In that case, he suggests that they talk about magic with the time they have left. Eager, they go to a place where they can drink tea. As they sit in an area with seats perfect for enjoying food later on, Luke makes a comment about how the tea smells. Libera tells him it was the most suitable tea to accompany discussing magic. It was the tea leaves that Luke made. With a smile, he asks her if she found it delicious. She thanks him for always sending them some. Fixing her glasses, she says she wants to jump straight into the topic. She asks if she could give her personal opinion on his original spell, Val, to which Luke agrees to. "You just opened the floodgates, Luke." Before he knew it, she was going on and on about her thoughts on attributeless magic. Luke wonders if it was because of Malsa's influence that she was mostly focused on the topic of attributeless magic. Despite this, Luke leans forward, finding it interesting that she seems highly knowledgeable about all aspects. As Libera finishes off her thoughts on Val's potential, her eyes are shining at the thought of what else Luke will be able to do in the future. Luke smiles, thinking how she was just like Malsa, but also because he thought she might be a good research partner. They continue their conversation with the time they have left before Libera notices that the other students around them are starting to get up from their seats and heading in one direction. She starts packing the tea set she had with her, stating that it was almost time for the main event of the day. They enter the Magic Academy Great Hall for the entrance ceremony. As they enter, Luke takes the time to look around. He recognized some faces as he looked around, such as Akari and Ruby among them. Suddenly, he catches sight of black hair from the corner of his eyes. Memories of a familiar dark-haired man and an ugly white-haired man, battered and bruised on the floor, come to his mind. For a second, his thoughts are a mess as he thinks of a sword swinging down. Luke watches as the boy smiles, realizing who he was. The black-haired man stops talking to the person with him, catching sight of Luke from across the room. His soft look turns harsh and confrontational as he glares daggers at Luke. Luke couldn't help but have a really bad feeling. He frowns. That should have been the first time they've met, but it didn't seem like the same case for the young man with black hair. Libera turns to Luke, asking what was wrong. Luke doesn't take his eyes off of the black-haired man. but he tells Libera that he was wondering why the other male was staring at him as if he was his archenemy. Libera follows Luke's line of sight to see what he was looking at from across the room. She immediately recognizes him as Dan, a knight apprentice. She tells Luke it was most likely because the Marshall family he serves and the Descustos family were in enemy factions. The Marshall family led the royal faction after all. As Luke watches Dan angrily sit down, he thinks how they were enemies from birth. Your goal of being chill for the rest of your life is so much harder if the protagonist himself hates your guts. As they take their own seats, Libera tells Luke that Linshin, the person sitting next to Dan, was accomplished in martial arts. Linshin was from House Marshall. Although she was apparently not that great with magic, her appraisal was the shield attribute, so I guess her focus is defense. Dan was Linshin's attendant and his appraisal was growth. I don't know how this works, but I'm guessing he can get better than other people faster. Luke wonders if Libera knew everyone else's attributes. It was like she was a walking attribute dictionary, which is really weird because you'd think magic attributes were only for the government and other institutions to know about so openly. Linshin was a family knight and childhood friends with the protagonist. If the player chose her, they would get the standard route as a knight of House Marshall. Even if they failed at conquering any other love interest, they could still marry her. She was one of those pity heroines the player didn't even need to work for. That's kind of sad when you think about it. Her ending makes her out to be a good wife that loves her husband and children very much. That was also true if someone other than the protagonist ends up with her. I find it rather interesting that if the player doesn't choose their route, the love interest ends up with someone else. Most games don't seem to do that. In another route, Luke captures Linshin and she appears as Luke's wife and the player's enemy. That's definitely one way to go about it. Poor Linshin. Her pure, devoted personality becomes her downfall. The fight with her after that really shows off her essential beauty. It was honestly a point worthy of praise for Luke. Meanwhile, Dan had made it into the academy as Linshin's attendant. Dan was just a commoner, but his father was known as an honorable knight and he can use attribute magic. He's been battling monsters and practicing fighting ever since he was a kid. Dan aimed to carry on the legacy of his deceased father at the academy and become a knight of House Marshall, which was why he hated the Descustos family, who were leaders of the noble faction. At the rate they were at, Dan would probably come for Luke too. Luke thinks it was nothing but a pain. He's brought out of his thoughts when the school valedictorian is called on stage for the speech. A girl walks in as they introduce her as Irina Schildeborg Alecidas. Irina was the first princess of the kingdom of Alecidas. Also, she was another love interest. As her speech goes on, Luke yawns, saying that she's been talking for ages already and he was getting bored. Libera points out that Irina was really beautiful and asks if Luke wasn't the slightest bit interested in her sis. Even if she is pretty to look at, that's not going to stop him from being bored out of his mind. Luke tells her that there was no way he was interested. For him, he couldn't deny that she was beautiful, but he wasn't interested in her in the game either. Luke had already gotten used to pretty people because of his sister Iris. But most of all, Luke tells Libera that he already had a fiancé and someone else he loved. Unknown to Luke, as he takes out a pouch, Libera mutters to herself that she couldn't let her guard down because he already liked 2 people. Sis, he already said he liked other people. Chill. Libera is suddenly surprised to see a large slime appear holding a large pillow in its body. Luke had taken out Val from his pouch, the slime expanding in size. Libera asks if Luke was about to take a nap and Luke says yes. He asks if she minds, but Libera says that although she was terribly interested in Val, it wasn't something they should be discussing during the ceremony, so she'd wake him up once everything was over. Luke agrees with her plan and thanks her. Contentedly leaning back on the large pillow, Luke is thankful that Libera was understanding. The ceremony continues on. Unbeknownst to Luke, Linshin and Dan had been looking at him. Eventually, Luke's eyes open as someone calls out his name. He asks Libera if the event was over already. She tells him to get up since all the other students had already left. He sits up to find the entire hall empty except for them. With a sleepy yet satisfied expression on his face, he tucks the pillow back into its pouch. With bright eyes, Libera asks if that was the rumored pillow. Luke is confused by her words. Libera explains that when her father Malsa had first met Luke, he was floating on a pillow. With a rather bashful expression, Luke confirms that it was the very same pillow. As he tucks the pouch into his pocket, he tells Libera that he would let her ride it when they get some spare time. Excited at the idea, Libera lights up and thanks him. Luke loved people who were honest to their interests. With a rather pained expression, Libera shakes her fists at the thought that if only they didn't have orientation coming up, then she could have had a chance. Luke comments that she really did love magic. Suddenly taking her hand in his, Luke leads that way, saying that they should get moving too. Libera's face turns red at his sudden touch. Luke immediately lets go, asking if that was no good. Suddenly flustered that he let go, Libera holds his hand again. "Sis, make up your mind, Lamau." She says that it was fine and that she was just surprised because she's never held hands with a boy before. Sis is a lot more honest than we thought, I see. With a charming smile, Luke then says that he guessed he would need to take responsibility for stealing a maiden's first. Bro, be careful with your wording or someone's going to misunderstand you. He politely asks if he could escort her to the classroom. Libera's face goes increasingly red as she comments how soft Luke's hands were. That's called the power of lotion. As they walk the school grounds, they come across Linshin and Libera. Seeing them holding hands, Linshin frowns. She turns her head away before calling Luke a coward. Libera flinches at her words, stuttering. Completely flustered, she calls out to Linshin, saying that they weren't doing anything. But Linshin doesn't turn around and Dan only glances at her. Luke swings their intertwined hands together to call Libera's attention back to him, telling her to calm down and not worry about it. Indignantly, Libera asks if Luke wasn't angry, but Luke calmly replies that he wasn't. He tells her that there was no point in wasting energy on it. Libera laughs lightly, saying that it was just like him to say that. Luke adds that he'd have much more fun using that energy to talk to her. Libera's face brightens at his words, rather caught off guard. She asks if he had fun talking to her, and Luke admits that he did. Her face completely glowing, she says that she enjoyed talking to him as well. Oh bro, you're going to be collecting more fans before you know it. Her voice energetic, she hurries him on for them to get the orientation over with quickly. They quickly settle into class 0. Seeing that they were free to choose where to sit, Luke and Libera take the seats at the back, classic protagonist move, but also if he falls asleep, hopefully no one notices him lol. As the class settles in, a man rushes to the front of the class seeing that everyone was already there. The man introduces himself as Glorin Research. First we had Karen and the Caribbean Sea, and now we have Research the teacher El Mao. He was the same teacher that gave the explanation in the game. A girl stands beside him and introduces herself as the assistant teacher for the class. Her name was Silas, and Luke was excited to finally see her. In the game, she was the most difficult love interest. Silas was also known as the witch who saw the abyss of magic. She may look young, but she was actually an elf, one of the spirit races, and is hundreds of years old. Including the 3 scholarship students, Class 0 had 20 students in total. Everyone there scored highly on the entrance exam. Glorin emphasizes that status didn't matter at the academy, and the students would instead be judged solely on their abilities. Linshin suddenly raises her hand, and when Glorin calls her, she asks how they would be able to find out their rank and how capable they were. Glorin fixes his monocle with a grin as he thanks her for the excellent question, clearly excited. Striking a pose and emphasizing his wrist, he tells them that it would be possible with their brand new invention, the magic watch. That's a smartwatch, right? Both Luke and Libera's faces light up in amazement as they turn to their wrists. Luke, why are you so amazed? You're from the modern world. The watches on their wrists light up. With an almost crazed expression, Glorin explains that the brand new invention records the student's unique mana signature and allows them to look up their grades and rank at will. As a screen flashes in front of Luke, his face lights up with recognition. It was the stat screen from the academy part of the game. On the screen was his name, age, current level, number of monsters defeated, classroom, and a more detailed explanation of his stats. Seeing that they were able to use it, Glorin explains that they recorded everyone's mana signature, but they only allow the person themselves to see the finer details. The recognition system was built on the student's mana signature. Looking back at his magic watch stat screen, it listed that his no non-attribute magic consisted of daily magic, strength magic, support magic, restoration magic, and unknown. Luke guessed that the unknown non-attribute was Val. Meanwhile, his known attribute magic was sleep and sloth magic. Glorin continues that the rank of their grades and the class they belonged to was public. After all, the faculty needed to see that too. Swiping the floating screen, Luke checks the ranking of the 300 first years. Overall rank 1 was Arena, while he was rank 2. Overall rank 2 on your first day is crazy work, OMG. Practical rank 1 was Ruby, while he was rank 10. Studies rank 1 was Miral, while he was rank 5. And Magic rank 1 was Libera, while he was rank 2. Being rank 10 as your lowest rank is almost insane. Luke glances at Libera with a smile, already expecting her ranking in Magic. With a crazed expression, Glorin asks the class what they thought of the Magic Watch, reasoning that magic tools were the greatest resources to further humanity. As he continued to go on about magic tools, lost in his passion, Silas pulled at his clothes, telling him to continue with the lesson. It was clear to Luke that Glorin was also a magic tool maniac. Watching him go on, Libera comments that Glorin was a rather bizarre person. Luke thinks that she hasn't realized that she was a magic maniac too, and she and Glorin were one and the same. Suddenly, Luke leans closer to Libera's seat, asking how her grades were. They both flinch, realizing that the whole class had now turned to them. Well, that's really awkward. The both of them caught off guard. Libera whispers to Luke that they should talk about it later. Clearing her throat, Silas sends Glorin over to the window to cool down as she explains the rest of the class. She starts her discussion about the academy by telling them that they were free to choose whatever subjects they wanted. That's an awesome way to go about school subjects. She takes an empty paper envelope in hand. With a single burst of flames, it turns to ash in her hands. She reminds them that ranks weren't solely dependent on their grades, so they should choose subjects they wanted to study or that they think will help them in the future. Flourishing her hands, she tells them that their growth was up to them. However, that also meant that if their grades dropped, they'll be mercilessly kicked down by a lower class. There was one exception, the Sword Emperor Cup. Silas tells them that it was the Academy's greatest event, held every year and attracting major attention from the wider world. Even if a student's magic and academic grades were low, if they did well during the event, they could remain in the higher classes. Not only that, but the victor would also receive an honorary knight title and the right to challenge the winner of the National Sword Emperor Cup. Silas hoped that they would all attempt to win the cup at least once during their 3 years there. Internally, Luke thinks of how Dan's first goal was to become a knight, and that meant winning the School Sword Emperor Cup. Becoming an honorary knight also made the person a noble, and rising in the ranks like that can come in handy too, such as having permission to travel through territories. Silas continues that as part of the school system surrounding the Sword Emperor Cup, practice matches were permitted, or as they were called, ranking battles. The students could find the exact rules on their watches, but Silas gives them a brief rundown. Their ranks were essential to holding a battle. The ranking battle rules were as follows. To have a battle, lower-ranked students could only challenge others of higher rank, and if someone is challenged, they're not allowed to refuse, but the battle won't start until they accept. If the challenger wins, they can steal the higher-ranking opponent's rank and they get transferred to the appropriate class. If the challenger loses, however, they cannot challenge the same opponent again for 6 months, and if they lose 5 times, they can never challenge that opponent again. Both individual and team battles are possible, at the discretion of the challenged person. A student may only take part in one individual and one team battle per day. If the student falls ill or feels unwell, they can send out a representative to fight on their behalf. And finally, if the student cannot produce a representative or keep refusing to fight for an extended period of time, they will lose by default. There were a few more important details, but that was the gist of it. Just like the game, it was lenient to the loser. The rules were set up to fight the villainous Luke. Luke's original role was to be the first person to get taken down in the ranking battles, specifically to lose to Dan, the game's protagonist. It was a necessary scene to cement the fated rivalry between Luke and Dan in the game, though to the Luke right now it was nothing but a pain. With a dark look on his face, he thinks of how the troublesome scenes of the game have finally caught up to him. Dan suddenly raises his hand and calls out to the teacher. He asks when they could start challenging people to ranking battles. Oh god, this can't be good. Glorin says that as soon as they've registered the watch, they were allowed to. Slamming his hands on the table and getting up, Dan announces that he wanted to challenge someone right then and there. Turning around, he declares to have a fight with Luke. Dan and Luke glare at each other. Just then, Luke's watch makes a small chime. It had finally started. The challenge had appeared on his watch. That scene was the tutorial battle, the first job lined up for the villainous noble Luke. Chapter 8. This was how the tutorial fight went down in the game. Luke was enrolled on his talent for magic alone, so of course he lost to Dan, a knight apprentice. After that, Luke started targeting Dan to take revenge. For Dan, it was a chance to increase his affection with the surrounding people, living a fulfilling academy life, while Luke was left to grind his teeth in the background. The original Luke flew into a frenzy over being challenged by a mere commoner. But the Luke right now wasn't the original. With an almost disgusted look on his face, Luke waves Dan's words away, saying that he wasn't doing that. I thought they weren't allowed to say no though, Lamau? Dan exclaims in disbelief. He tries to provoke Luke, saying that he was just scared, but Luke responds that it was just a pain, making Dan more pissed. With a frown, Luke plainly states that he was rank 2, before asking what rank Dan was. Dan says that he was rank 20, and Luke immediately points out that while Dan had an opportunity to increase his ranking, Luke himself had nothing to gain by accepting. He adds that he didn't want to fight an idiot who couldn't even understand something so simple. Suddenly, another person stands up, unable to listen to the bickering any longer. Linshin turns to Luke and bumps her fist into her chest where her heart was. She declares that as a noble of their glorious country, accepting a challenge should be a matter of fact, sis. He already said that he had nothing to gain from this. With a bored frown, Luke suggests that Linshin fight Dan instead. She's confused, but Luke pushes through and says that since her grades were pretty good too, then it should be fine because he was passing on the obligation. Linshin's face goes red, but she's unable to say anything more. Luke knew she was only a hot-headed and troublesome kid. Luke leans back on his seat quietly. He truly wanted to help, but only from behind the scenes. Helping goes directly against his creed of laziness, after all. I gotta hand it to his commitment to the bit OMG. Luke didn't want anything to do with troublesome stuff like that. As Linshin and Dan were left to stew in their anger, Irina suddenly stands up. She says that since Dan had an excellent practical score and Luke had an excellent magic score, she really wanted to see a fight between the two of them. Sis, even if Dan had an amazing score in practicals, Luke is still ranked 2 overall. He could hand his ass back to him. Linshin's face immediately lights up at her words. Turning to face him directly, Irina informs him that refusing would only make his rank fall, so he should follow the academy. But most importantly of all, Irina says that a noble of the country should guide the people. Luke's frown seems to deepen. With a flourish of her hands, she says that it was his duty to do so, and she wouldn't let him refuse. I think that's a horrible thing to say as a higher power. Let the guy step this one out. A dark look cast over his face, Luke curses at her in his thoughts. Internally, Luke points out that the teacher had specifically said that in the academy status didn't matter, only a student's grades. He sighs in annoyance, unable to stand the princess. Okay, yeah, I thought she was pretty at first too, but she's coming off a bit too strong now. However, Luke couldn't deny that it would be difficult to refuse both the princess and the daughter of a duke. He buries his head in his fist, grumbling at his problem. Finally, he says that she was right. The others are content with his answer. Oh, I wonder if they'll still be feeling satisfied when all this is over. For Luke, it seemed like he was too weak to resist the flow of the game all by himself. Later on, Luke and Libera walked down the school grounds. He knew he didn't have a choice, but Luke still thought it was such a pain. He really didn't want to move around so much. He extends a hand and calls out to Val. In order to fulfill Luke's role, he needed to lose the duel, but he didn't even know how he lost. Ahead of them, Dan and Linshin walk in the same direction. Beside him, Libera asks him if he was alright. She tells him that she's heard that he greatly disliked exercise. Libera points out that his opponent was a knight apprentice at Duke Marshall's and they were famous fighters. She thinks that Dan was pretty used to fighting, judging from his exam results, but Luke reassures her that he was fine. With a bright smile, he tells her that this was a piece of cake for him, especially since he's not going to be doing the brunt of the work anyway, lol. Libera stares up at him in awe, but the moment is ruined when Luke lets out a loud yawn. Libera laughs, saying that Luke truly was a mysterious person. She points out that he's invented magic nobody else would have ever thought of, and he refused to fight despite being a noble. Confused on how her last sentence had anything to do with each other, Libera explains that nobles valued their pride very highly. She reassures him that she was complimenting him. Luke smiles and says that it was fine and that he wouldn't want her to dislike him. In a loud voice, Libera assures him that she doesn't dislike him, nor would she ever. We love a loyal bestie. As Luke and Libera continue to chat happily, Dan and Linshin in front of them walk in silence, focused on their next task. Stepping into the gates, Luke thinks how he hasn't been there since the entrance exam. Again, they find themselves inside the arena. Linshin guides Dan as he does some stretches to prepare for the match. Meanwhile, Luke looks up at the audience stands. Their classmates had attended, eager to witness the first ranking match. Lauren walks in, asking if the both of them were ready, and Dan eagerly says yes. Pointing his blade at Luke, he declares that he would beat his rotten personality into shape. Dan says that he watched Luke during the exam and he was just lying down the whole time. Are you telling me that all his anger is coming from the fact that Luke was chilling during his time in the exam? What did he want him to do? Luke doesn't look at him. Instead, he asks Libera to wait from the sidelines, to which Libera hesitantly accepts. Dan bristles at the fact that Luke wasn't listening to him and shouts for Luke not to ignore him, but he cuts him off. Turning to him with a chilling look in his eyes, Luke tells him to just be grateful that he was willing to fight him. His words make Dan's anger spike even more, making him call Luke an arrogant prick. Angrily, Dan asks Luke what his level was. Levels were the number that increased the more monsters one defeated. Since it was a game, he maxed it out when he first saw it. But since strategy and basics were so much more important now, he hasn't been worrying about it. Unconcerned, Luke brings out his stat screen. With a blank voice, he tells Dan that he was level 1. Crazy that he's still at level 1. Dan looks at him dumbfounded. Suddenly he explodes, pointing out that Luke had never fought a monster before and saying that he was supposed to be a noble. Luke is confused why being a noble had anything to do with fighting monsters. Clenching his fist tight, Dan mutters that Luke was even worse than he thought. Just because he was at level 1 is crazy work. Glorin calls out to them, telling them to step forward for the battle. In a carefree tone, Luke tells them to have a nice fight or whatever. Dan stays quiet, the look on his face solemn and serious as he raises his sword in a battle stance. Lowering his arm, Glorin announces the official start of the match. Dan immediately rushes in, sword raised. In the game, Luke was in Dan's shoes and it was a turn-based RPG where one selected commands. However, no such commands appeared right now, so he only had one way to fight. Holding out his arm, Luke summons Val and lets his magic envelop him. He orders him to take full control for a full minute. He makes sure to add for Val to take care for neither of them to get badly hurt. With a cat-like smile, Val agrees to his orders. As Dan swings his sword down, Val covers Luke. Now all he needed to do was surrender when he woke up. Luke raises his arm and uses magic to block against Dan's swing. Dan is surprised that his sword was so easily caught. When he pulls his sword back, Luke or Val gives him a cat-like smile from underneath his raised arm. Time passes and slowly the fog of sleep eventually leaves Luke and he wakes up to hear a pained grunt. When he opens his eyes, he finds himself holding Dan up by his neck using his magic. Dan is bruised and bloodied. In a shaky voice, he orders Luke to let go of him. Internally, Luke makes a small, half-hearted apology. Dan tries to lift his sword and slash at him, but without much effort, Luke uses his leg to send his sword flying. Luke watches as it goes sliding across the floor, far away from them. He turns to Dan, wondering what to do next. Just as Luke had ordered, Dan wasn't badly hurt. In the game, no matter how badly Dan messes up during the match, he would end it by using his secret attribute magic technique and win. But Luke felt like it was impossible for him to lose in that situation. Pulling his fist back for a punch, Luke says that he would end the fight. Dan raises his arms, trying to use his abilities, but he is too late. Before his magic could take effect, Luke orders him to sleep. He goes slack in Luke's hold. Dan's attribute, Magic Boost, was a cheat ability that supercharges his strengthening magic. It massively empowers both his magic and strength. But due to his current lack of experience, it wasn't that effective yet. And since his magic tolerance was low, he couldn't fight off sleep. Luke didn't do his job of losing, but it would still be bad for him, a villain, to win. Turning his gaze to the crowd, Luke decided that he needed to trick them. He pushes Dan slightly farther away from him, covering him in his magic. Then using Val, he rapidly lifts Dan's body up in the air. Lynchen asks him with rising panic what he was doing, and Glorin stares in horror. Glorin declares Luke the winner and orders him to let Dan down. Without a second to lose, Luke closes his fist and releases his magic, causing Dan to freely fall. Lynchen and the rest of the class stare in terror as Dan plummets to the ground. Glorin makes a break for it and barely makes it in time to catch Dan. Honestly, points for him for actually running like a track star for his student. The force sends Glorin to his knees from the pain. Lynchen runs into the battle area and kneels beside Dan. She looks up at Luke and screams at him, calling him scum and saying that Dan was already unconscious. Luke was more than annoyed since she was clearly disparaging the winner. He wonders where the noble pride suddenly went. He found it lame more than anything. Looking down at her darkly, he repeats that he didn't want to fight in the first place, and she forced him into it, so she should have been prepared for that outcome. Turning to his other classmates, he informs them that right now, he would accept any challenge to a ranking match. It was a good deal after all. Pushing back his hair and looking at them darkly, he says that surely he might have been exhausted by then. Lynchen looks at him dumbfounded for a second before she turns away and grits her teeth in barely concealed anger. Seeing his classmates' silence, Luke then says that while he was at it, he would teach them something important. Luke respected the smart, and he respected those who pursued magic. And he also detested idiots who had nothing but brute force. He raises his arm, summoning his magic. He says that if anyone challenged him and they were a barbarian like Dan, he would make certain that they could never challenge him again. Closing his fist tightly, his magic scatters all around him. With a chilling look in his eyes, Luke says that they won't ever see the light of another day. Damn, bro, I thought your villain arc was over. In the audience seats, his classmates are a mix of nervous and in awe. Arena watches on in silence. Luke was sure that his classmates would gossip about his little villain act. He just hoped that meant that he wouldn't receive any more challenges. Getting up from the ground, Lynchen declares that such villainous acts couldn't go unpunished. She swears that Dan would one day defeat him and Luke would come to regret what he did. But Luke had already turned away. We stand an unbothered king. As he passes by Libra, he calls her over for them to leave. When they're far away enough, Libra glances behind them and asks Luke if he was sure that he wasn't going to tell them anything. Luke asks her what she meant. She says that Luke was about to catch Dan before he hit the ground using Val. Yeah, I figured he wasn't so evil as letting the protag literally drop dead. Yawning, Luke merely says that he was lazy, so he would rather chill in magic studies than try to explain it. Besides, to Luke, Dan was an idiot who immediately picked a fight with him over his own conceited sense of justice. He asks Libera if she thought he would have been able to explain anything to him. Luke felt like he already tried to talk to him more than enough that day. Libra says that his answer seemed reasonable. However, a familiar light voice asks him if he was sure about what he was doing. Luke sighs in annoyance, his face dark. In barely concealed annoyance, Luke asks what Arena wanted from him. Arena tells him to call her by her first name since they were classmates. His expression not getting any lighter, Luke tells her he can call him by his first name as well before demanding to know what she wanted again. Almost innocently, Arena comments that he was the only one who'd look at her like that. Luke pointedly thanks her for the compliment. Internally, he thinks that Arena didn't understand that they couldn't treat her like that because she was royalty. He really couldn't deal with her. Arena continues that her brother has told her about Testa. Luke remembers that their older brothers were in the same year and both were the top 2 students of the school. With glittering eyes, she tells him that she finally understood that Luke really did live up to the Descustos family name. She thanks him for showing her such a wonderful match. Turning around, she says that that was all she wanted to say and she excuses herself. As they watch her go, Luke wonders what she even came there for. Libera ponders out loud that Irina really didn't hate him. Luke asks her what that was all about, but Libera awkwardly tells him not to worry about it. Instead, she congratulates him for a good job in getting through orientation day. I didn't even realize that all that happened in a single day. Whoa! That night, Luke leans out a balcony with a content smile. Someone asks him what he was doing out there and he says that he was just catching his breath. Luke had spent dinner with Karen. He tells her that he ate so much seeing as it's been a while since he last had her cooking. Karen is glad to hear that he liked it. She stands up and heads over to the balcony with him. Luke presses a kiss to her head, saying that nothing cheered him up quite like her food, bro. At this point, are you still in love with just her food? Come on now. Karen tells him not to praise her too much or she would end up getting carried away. Luke tells her to get carried away all she wanted since she was very accomplished with all her successful projects anyway. She points out that it was only all thanks to him, but Luke retorts that he only gave a few pieces of advice. He says that the achievements belong to her, the person who made a business using the ideas, and the Caribbean family for their support. Karen tells him that being too humble was also an issue since she really wanted to praise him too. Why are they so sweet, OMG? Luke tells her not to worry about him since he was having the Caribbean family support him, so her getting rich trickles down to him anyway. Karen laughs, saying that he was the only noble who would say something like that. She places her hand over his and asks if he was serious, to which Luke says of course. After all, the two of them have talked a lot over the years. Karen knew everything about him by now. She knew his family couldn't care less about him and she knew all he wanted was a lazy and healthy life. She even knew that what he fell in love with was her cooking, but despite knowing all that, she had kept loving him all the same. She's too pure for this world, bro. Don't break her heart. Leaning on his shoulder, she softly asks him if he still loved her only because of her cooking. Luke reassures her that he loved her very much as well now, so much so that he didn't want to leave her side. Bro, you better. She's been there through thick or thin. Luke asks her if he could stay the night in her room. Ayo bro, too soon. Karen laughs, embarrassed, reminding him that they weren't married yet. Getting down on one knee, Luke reassures her that even if one of their families fell into ruin, he would love her more than anything and he couldn't live without her anymore. With a hand to his chest, he asks her to let him stay by her side for the night. With a resigned smile, Karen playfully calls him a villain, saying that if he went that far, no woman would be able to refuse him. The two of them sitting on Val, Luke uses his magic to let them float into the air. As he pulls her close, Karen tells him that if he ever brought anyone except Syrup out on one of their mid-air walks, she was going to be jealous. Luke reassures her that he'll keep it in mind. Bro, they're so sickly sweet and domestic. The next morning, when the sun has barely risen, Dan is jogging around the school grounds when he suddenly spots something from the distance. He noticed that other people were already out and about that early. Peeking over his high vantage point, he realizes that it was Luke. He wonders what in the world he was doing at that hour. Luke was doing stretches as he yawned, but Dan suddenly looked panicked. He was worried that Luke was planning some sort of villainous scheme. Luke is literally wearing a shirt and some loose pants. Nobody does anything nefarious in sweats, Dan. Calm down. Dan's about to summon his magic when something suddenly lights up. His attention is forced back on Luke as his magic envelopes him. Luke had taken on a fighting stance. In a succession of moves, Luke performs a series of hits and kicks, his body moving seamlessly. Dan wondered if he was dancing. His moves were completely flawless. Dan's eyes glittered, mesmerized by how beautiful it looked. As Luke carried on with his exercise using Val, Dan really thought it looked like a dance. But suddenly he froze. The more he watched, the more he realized that his moves were just like that of a seasoned martial artist. Normally, physical abilities improved alongside one's level. People almost never lose when up against someone with a much lower level. However, Dan still lost. At first he thought it was just because he let his guard down against a low-leveled opponent, but he realized that wasn't the answer at all. Luke was just extremely strong in every way. So strong he could overcome a massive level difference. Luke wasn't screwing around when he told Libera his fight with Dan would be a piece of cake for him. Dan clenched his fists. He's never heard of anything like Luke's tactics before, but he knew better than anyone that it was true. Luke had acted like such a carefree, spoiled son of a noble, but Dan realized he was a really hard worker. Dan couldn't be more wrong and right at the same time. Dan had trained every single day since all he could think about was becoming an awesome knight like his teachers. In the martial territory where fighting meant everything, that was enough for him. But he was sure that no matter how hard he trained, it wouldn't be enough to catch up to him. He grins, asking himself what he was feeling at that moment. Looking up at the sky, almost resigned, he says that the world was larger than what he once thought. Dan tells himself that he would have to think about everything a lot more, Luke. You're already influencing the protagonist and you didn't even mean to. Now that's what I call true laziness. He goes back on his run. There was no doubt that the martial way of training makes someone stronger. His biggest problem right then was that he didn't have the knowledge to put that strength to good use. He didn't even understand anything about his attribute magic. He sucked at studying, but he tells himself that he just had to push through. Luckily, he couldn't wish for a better environment to study in than an academy. Thinking back to his last moments of consciousness during his first fight with Luke, Dan only wanted to beat him. Although he realized he can't even imagine how he'd get around to doing that. A plus for honesty and self-awareness, I guess. Running even faster, Dan yells to himself that things were no joke. With a determined smile on his face, he reassures to himself that he had only lost to Luke once. Dan would show him. He would surpass Luke someday for sure. He wipes the sweat off his face with a grin. It was just that right now he was so far ahead that he couldn't even see Luke in the distance. As he continues to run, Luke finishes his own workout using magic to recover his energy. At the cafeteria, Luke scans the room, Libera walking in behind him. He had to do something before he could get breakfast. Finally, he finds Iris looking exhausted and nauseous. He greets her good morning and she greets them both back in a tired voice. As she takes a sip of her breakfast honey tea, she reminds him to eat a proper breakfast and he reassures her that he would. It was a mystery to him how she can look out for others when she herself was suffering from low blood pressure. Not to mention she was obviously in a bad mood. As Luke continued to watch his sister, he thought that it looked like just going to the academy had turned his sister into someone capable of caring for others, which is rather odd. Because from hearing about the game, you'd think his family was always villainous. As a high-ranking noble, Iris must always act both kind and strict. Her beauty and divine voice have only grown stronger. Iris was also the main organizer of the newcomer party held by the noble faction. Luke showed up to say hello as the freshman representative. Unfortunately, he quickly gathered interest as someone who had turned the tables on a student from the royal faction. Eventually, Luke and Libera excuse themselves and Iris gives them a half-hearted farewell, telling him to give it his best. Luke thinks of Karen's words, wondering if she should suggest making a supplement to fight against low blood pressure, like an iron supplement. I guess they don't have that yet. After brushing his teeth, Luke opens a door back to the school corridors, but the students that notice his sudden presence all flinch. Looking around at the way they acted, it looked like the rumors of his sensational first had already spread. The royal faction outwardly showed their disgust and contempt for him, while the noble faction looked at him with respect and admiration. The center faction and the commoners showed interest, but it looked like they didn't know what to do about it. As he and Libera enter their classroom once more, Linshin notices him and flinches before quickly looking away. Luke walks by her and they don't say a word to each other. It seemed to him that his threats had worked. They should stay out of his hair for the time being. Leaning back on his seat with a content smile, Luke happily thinks that he could finally focus on studying in peace. First, he needed to consider what courses to take. There were two kinds of courses in the academy: compulsory subjects, which were general education, and elective subjects, which included magic, practical skills, and the like. He guessed it was just like modern universities. In the game, the lessons chosen served the role of raising one's stats. But with a joyous grin, Luke summons his stat screen and scrolls to his subjects. It didn't matter to him, so he would just pick whatever he liked. He wasn't taking a single practical subject, and he made sure that he had more than enough for the compulsory subjects. After that, he wanted to go for magic. He still needed more magic and knowledge in pursuit of laziness. Libera asks him if he's decided on what courses to take, and Luke tells her that he's chosen magic and magic tools as his main focus. He would make up for the rest with the compulsory subjects. Libera tells him that she chose the same route. Excitedly, she gets up. Since there were no more lessons for them for the day, she urged them to go. She skips down the steps, saying that they needed to get to a private training room, confusing Luke. She tells him that they were private rooms where a student could study or practice skills as they needed. What facilities were available to the student depended on their class rank, but since they were in Class 0, they had the first choice of any facility. Luke thought that because of that, the ones already doing great only got even more of an advantage. Following Libera, Luke thinks to himself that assigning ranks to the students and announcing them publicly must be to stoke competition between the students like what was currently happening. Finally, Libera leads him to a specific room. As he enters, Luke is astounded to find how big the room was. Looking around, he asks Libera if the room was too large, but Libera kneels down on the floor and starts drawing. She says that they needed a final small touch. She draws a magic circle, and with a touch of her hand, it starts to glow. The room goes completely dark before seemingly blurring right before their eyes. When everything clears, the room looks like a regular study room. Libera turns back to Luke with bright eyes, telling him that she returned the space to its normal size. Luke looks around in awe. Luke says that they should be able to study in peace in the area. Libera asks him if it was his first time seeing that kind of magic. He tells her that he was the only one to use magic in his house. Magic that was so common it wasn't mentioned in books might be the rarest king for him. With a smile, he tells her that he was hoping that she would teach him a lot. Libera happily agrees. Turning to the drawing on the ground, Luke asks if it was indeed a magic circle. Libera tells him that it was necessary to cast the same spell without variance, although the ones in common tools were much smaller. Taking out what appeared to be a magic pen, Libera writes on air to demonstrate. The circle wouldn't activate unless it was drawn correctly, so the caster needed to practice to draw them properly. Smiling down at Val, Luke says that magic was handy but took a lot of effort. With attributeless magic, someone could just rely on their mana, but without proper imagination, it turns out very weak. And while attribute magic was very easy to understand and use, it still needed deep understanding and practice to master. Excited, Libera leans forward and asks him if he liked that part of magic too, to which Luke agrees. Libera says that the fact that it was deep was exactly what made it interesting. Finally, Luke says that they should get down to business. They take a seat from across each other on the table and write their information on their own pieces of paper. Luke goes through Libera's first. Her known attributeless magic was daily life magic, strength, support, restoration. Her attribute magic was water. She was at level 4 with 36 defeated monsters. For grades, she was overall in 7th place, 32nd in practical, 10th in studies, and 1st in magic. For some reason, I was expecting her to be higher in studies, but I guess she's just completely focused on magic. Luke asks about her water attribute, saying that it was pretty versatile, and Libera excitedly agrees. She says that water was great for both offense and defense and even had great support options. She was looking forward to experimenting with it. Luke smiles, saying that he was sure he would come up with a lot of uses for it. Libera tells him to feel free to expect a lot from her. Finally, Luke hands over his sheet of paper containing his magic, and Libera tells him that she's been waiting for this moment. However, the moment she reads it, she freezes in place. Looking back at him with a worried expression, she asks him if it was really fine for him to show her his information, because his kind of magic should be kept secret. Luke casually tells her that he would just tell others that it was magic that could manipulate human bodies. Libera tries to counter his words, but Luke just tells her that it was fine since her father also knew about it too. With a smile, he adds that surely she wouldn't tell anyone either. That sounds like a threat, sir. Without thinking twice, Libera promises to keep it a secret, and Luke thanks her. She figured that the sleep ability was what he used to make Dan faint so suddenly. However, she's never seen the sloth ability before. Excited, she exclaims that she couldn't wait to see how he would use them and that she was already looking forward to it. Luke lazily says that he felt the same. He points to the part of his magic that said unknown, telling her that it was bothering him. Libera figured that it was talking about Val, saying that maybe it was because original magic couldn't be recorded properly since it wasn't registered. Luke asks if it meant that the watch couldn't analyze unregistered magic. He suggests that maybe it used appraisal and references the Ministry of Magic's database. Libera offers that if the watch was equipped with appraisal, good enough to analyze attributeless magic, there would be a revolution in dungeon diving and gathering information about items. Holding up the magic watch, she says that to make such a great function fit into that small package, clearly there was a huge technical hurdle. In the first place, the limit of the mana the hardware could handle was just too low, and to make anything with a decent range, it would need to be lightweight, which they could only do with rare types of metals. Luke listened to her talk with a serene smile, nodding along happily. With an excited voice, Libera says that it looked like they could expect a lot from the magic watch in the future. Another day in class begins with Glorin talking about their extracurricular activities, namely their dungeon practice. Luke knew it as an event that all first years had to go through, but it was also an absolute pain for him. Glorin announces that they're going to be splitting the class into various teams. The first team, led by Irina, would consist of Akari, Libera, and Dan. Luke thought it rather rare for Linshin and Dan to be split up. Meanwhile, the second team would be led by Linshin and consist of Muriel, Ruby, and Luke. Glorin goes over the other team leaders and their members. When he finishes, he asks the class for any questions and Libera stands up. She reasons that as Luke's attendant, she wanted to be put in the same team as him. Kind of a weak excuse, not gonna lie. Especially since Linshin was just split from Dan too. Immediately, Glorin rejects her request. He reasons that the students had to think about the grade balance between the teams, and he asks her to bear with it for a bit. When Libera looks like she's about to argue more, Luke speaks up and says that it couldn't be helped. He reminds Libera to do her best in her own team. With a bright smile, he tells her not to get injured. Gloomily, Libera sits back down, saying that she understood. She frowns and says that she believed Luke would be all right, but reminds him not to be careless. As she says so, her eyes are trained on Linshin from the lower seats. Glorin then announces that the class could go to their respective teams so they could start the meeting. As instructed, everyone, including Luke's team, moves out and into another room. As team leader, Linshin stands before her members and introduces herself as Linshin Sword Marshal. I can't believe her middle name is literally Sword. Next, Miral introduces herself, but she was hiding behind Luke the entire time. She adds that she was a scholarship student in her department, someone who liked studying and wasn't good at fighting. Luke turns to her and wonders if Linshin really appeared so scary to others that it was enough for Miral to hide behind him. The other girl, Ruby, introduces herself next. She adds that she was an active adventurer, so if it was about dungeons, then they could rely on her. Keeping it simple, Luke smiles pleasantly and introduces himself. Suddenly, Miral speaks up and calls out to him respectfully, however she realizes how she referred to him and immediately asks if that was all right. When Luke allows it, she happily thanks him. With glittering eyes, Miral says if Luke needed anything, he shouldn't hesitate to ask. Whether it was bread or juice, she would gladly buy it for him. Because of her optimism, Luke wonders if she was an errand girl. Suddenly, Ruby comes up beside him and says that she wants to call him in the same respectful manner as well, and Luke gives her the go-ahead. Scooting closer, Ruby says that she was happy and thanks him for letting her. As she comes close, Luke notices her ears and remembers that she was a cat. He absent-mindedly raises his hand wanting to pet her ears but reminds himself to hold back. Yet just as he thinks it, Ruby says that he could pat her head if he wanted. Her words make Luke gape in shock, unable to believe what she just said. Ruby rubs her cheek against his shoulder and says that he could do whatever he wanted. Having had enough, someone yells out to the three of them. Miral hides behind Luke again as Linshin angrily shakes her fist at them with barely suppressed rage. Linshin demands to know what they were trying to do right then and argues that they were supposed to be discussing the dynamics of their team. She demands for them to listen properly, but Luke notices that her eyes are annoyingly trained on him as she says so. Realizing that Linshin was blaming him for the earlier mess, he's annoyed that things had become really troublesome. Eventually, all four of them find themselves sitting down. Luke absent-mindedly yawns and Miral immediately takes notice. She asks if he would like to take a break. Patting her lap, she offers that if Luke so wanted, he could use her lap as a pillow. Ruby winks at him and offers the same thing. Thinking about it, Luke disagrees with the idea immediately. Especially since the three of them only just met, the thought of a lap pillow was a bit too much. Watching them converse with an almost disgusted expression, Linshin calls them impure. She gets angry again and says that in the first place they were having a strategy meeting so Luke wasn't allowed to sleep. Luke can't help but think that she was being so fussy. He yawns again, fully aware that he wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully the way things were currently. Linshin starts their conversation again on their final checks. Since she was a knight, Linshin says that she'll be on the front lines. Ruby says that she'll be on the front lines as well. She uses a dagger and a bit of attribute magic. Above all, she could just dodge the enemies. Miral says that she'll be the rear guard. She was confident in her healing magic and she could also do some archery. And finally, with a heavy sigh, Luke says that he wanted to sleep, making Linshin exclaim in complete anger. She explodes, asking what was up with his attitude. But Miral just says that she understood. She smiles and says that he could go ahead and sleep, and since they were both part of the rear guard, she would carry for him. Linshin exclaims again, this time in confusion. Ruby calmly scratches at her ears and says that it was fine with her if he only moved if they were in trouble. Finally losing it, Linshin gets up and yells that the reason Luke was getting carried away was because Miral and Ruby kept on coddling him. While Ruby merely sticks out her tongue, Miral hides behind Luke again. Linshin forces herself to calm down and ends their meeting for the day at that. On a final note, Linshin asks if they were all fine with challenging the dungeon that weekend, to which Luke and the others agree. Back out in the hallways, Miral and Ruby bid him farewell. Luke couldn't help but think that they were favoring him a bit too much, even though it was only their first time meeting. He couldn't understand, since he knew as the player that it would be difficult to get along with the heroines unless the player had already solved their respective problems first. He wonders if they were trying to appeal to him because he was part of a ducal household. However, he stops short and wonders if they were seeing him as some sort of idol. Either way, he decides that it was better than being hated. As he walks down the halls, he stops short as he recognizes someone. Seeing that it was Libra and Dan talking to one another, it looked like the first team was done too. Luke wonders if she managed to get along with the rest of the team. Suddenly, Libra exclaims as she catches sight of him. She walks over to him quickly and grabs onto his hand. Luke asks if she was leaving her conversation with Dan prematurely, but Libera reassures him that there was no issue. Luke smiles at her, but he couldn't help but wonder if Dan still hated them. Luke glances behind him, but his eyes widen to find the calm look on Dan's face. From his point of view, Dan's hostility had disappeared. He always thought that the protagonist would keep on hating him. Luke couldn't help but find that it felt quite strange. Time passes and eventually it's the weekend. Team 2, consisting of Linshin, Luke, Miral, and Ruby, are deep in the forest dungeon. It was a dungeon located in the mountains behind the school. Since the number of the monsters here were hunted down by students, its rank was pretty low compared to its large size. Dungeons had a maximum rank level of 10. The forest dungeon in particular was rank 2. People went to the dungeons to look for resources. They could find magic stones from the monsters that allowed them to power magic tools. A dungeon's core was said to be a great mass of mana. Adventurers were then dispatched to lessen the number of monsters, keeping dungeons at a suitable rank. As they continue deeper into the forest, Miral fusses over Luke as he lay on his pillow trying to sleep. Miral asks if he was feeling tired, or if he would like to drink something. When Luke tells her that he was fine, she seems to deflate before asking if he needed anything else. Luke instead tells her to fire an arrow at a monster hanging from a faraway tree. Miral immediately does what he says. Luke had finally realized why Miral had such a favorable impression of him. A few days back, while he was spending time with Karen, she had told him that she heard everything from Miral. Luke is confused, but Karen reminds him of a time where he had cured Miral's little brother in the past. Karen adds that Miral was really grateful to him. Luke tries to remember Miral and her brother. Finally, he remembers the orphanage. Luke asks why Miral had told Karen about it. Karen explains that Miral said that since she and Luke were put in the same team, she wanted to repay Luke somehow. Miral even went out of her way to get Karen's Luke's fiance's permission. Kinda crazy when you think about it that Miral offered Luke a lap pillow despite knowing not only that he had a fiance, but also personally knowing who that fiance is. Karen laughs, saying that Miral seemed to hold a debt of gratitude quite well. Luke reasons that he wasn't really trying to make Miral owe him though. However, thanks to her, Luke could now take it easy while they were exploring the dungeon. In the present, Miral smiles proudly as she says that she was able to defeat it. Ruby suddenly pops up with a sack, announcing that she was able to gather the magic stone. Luke welcomes her back and Ruby comments that since the monsters weren't moving, it was pretty easy to acquire. Their happy atmosphere is suddenly cut off when someone calls out to them. Linshin asks them what part of what they were doing was dungeon clearing, much to Luke's confusion. Linshin exclaims that they weren't fighting anything at all. Luke doesn't tell her that it was because he put all of the monsters around them to sleep. The plan was that Miral would kill them with her bow, and Ruby would take their magic stones and kill off any stragglers. Luke was rather jealous of Linshin since he barely had to move at all. Luke lets out a heavy and irritated sigh as he asks her what she was so dissatisfied with. Linshin responds that it was everything. She exclaims that both Luke and the monsters were sleeping and nothing was like normal combat practice at all. Luke calmly asks Miral in his place, to which Miral dutifully follows. She turns to Lynch and says that she would make her understand for Luke's sake. Miral explains that the reason Luke was sleeping was because he could use magic even when he was in an unconscious state. It also helped him focus on his magic more. The magic Luke uses makes the monsters fall asleep. Linshin flinches at the look on Miral's face and her words, but she continues. Miral says that thanks to Luke, even someone like her who didn't particularly excel in combat, can go into a dangerous dungeon and practice archery all the while increasing her level. With a bright smile, Miral looks at Linshin and asks if she finally understood how kind Luke was and what he's been doing this whole time. It's almost scary how thankful she is to Luke. Luke noticed that Miral was acting completely different from when she first introduced herself. Miral then turned around and, to Luke's surprise, bowed her head to him. He wonders if she was looking for some praise, and so he pets her head and praises her for a job well done. Miral immediately grins, pleased. Suddenly Ruby rushes in saying that it was unfair because she wanted her head pat too. In the end, both of Luke's hands are occupied patting Ruby and Miral's heads. Kinda funny that bro does not really care what's going on, but he'll do it anyway. Meanwhile, Linshin grits her teeth and says that that was exactly what was so strange about it. She explodes, saying that a dungeon was supposed to be a dangerous place. They should have been strengthening their bond by helping each other, slowly but surely getting better as a team. That's a rather optimistic way of seeing things, if I do say so myself. Instead, Linshin says that if things carried on as they did, they were basically just doing labor. Her rant is cut off when Luke cuts in and asks what was so bad about being able to clear a dungeon safely and easily. Linshin has a rather conflicted look on her face as she tries to reason that it wasn't a bad thing per se, but Luke cuts in again. He points out that they could easily defeat monsters that needed to be hunted, so that meant it was better for both the people who wanted the monsters gone and the people who wanted the resources in the dungeon. Linshin clenches her fist and tries to argue more, saying that their current way of fighting wasn't quite right, but Luke frowns at her darkly and asks if she really wanted to thrust her comrades into danger that badly. Linshin immediately exclaims that she didn't, trying to give Luke a reason, but her voice dies out. Calmly, Luke asks if she finally understood which one of them was the one saying something they shouldn't. Linshin can only flinch at his words, staying quiet. Waving a hand, Luke tells her that they should disband for the day. Luke points out that they were only practicing right now anyway. He adds that if Linshin, the leader herself, wasn't really up for it, then the team should stop where they were. Before he can do or say anything more, Linshin tells Luke to stop. She softly apologizes and says that they should continue since they still had some time left. Luke lets out a soft sigh. As said, the team moved along. Linshin and Miral got to work taking down the monsters, Ruby got the magic stones while Luke stayed asleep, lulling the other monsters around him to sleep as well. Their day eventually ends. Miral says that she'll be sending the magic stones they got to the school. Luke yawns, glad that they could finally go home, but Linshin calls out to him. She asks to have a ranking match against him. Luke sighs heavily and with a dark look. He asks her if she already forgot what happened with Dan. Yeah, like watching your attendant fall from the sky is a bit much for a first fight. Linshin stays quiet, but her face barely hides her desperation. It doesn't faze Luke, however, and he even finds it troublesome. Luke orders Ruby to be Linshin's opponent, and Ruby immediately tells him to leave it to her. Linshin tries to argue that there wouldn't be a point if it wasn't him, but Luke cuts her off. Luke points out that if she had won, she was going to tell him to fight without using his magic. Luke asks her if she really wanted to fight and put the team's life on the line. The look on Luke's face is dark and terrifying as he says that he absolutely hated uncivilized people. He asks her if she really wanted to die. Linshin pushes for the duel. Girl is dead set on proving a point. Luke says that if Linshin just wanted to prove whether which of them was in the right, then it was all the same whether she fought him or Ruby. However, Luke was final when he said he wasn't going to fight. Eventually, Linshin agrees. Luke asks if Ruby was okay with it, to which she agrees as well. For Luke, the fight was a huge compromise. There really wasn't any reason for him to fight, but he knew that Linshin was an awkward person who couldn't express herself through anything but fighting. That's quite considerate of him actually, despite all the shots he threw at her. Ruby stands before Linshin and announces that as Luke's stand-in, she challenges Linshin to a ranking match. Linshin accepts, but Luke can only hope that the battle would be enough to satisfy her. Luke's group heads on over to the arena. As Linshin and Ruby enter the fighting ground, Linshin calls out to Ruby wanting to ask something. Linshin points out that since Ruby was an adventurer, she must be particular about dungeon fights, so she asks why she was so approving of Luke. Ruby lets out a smug sigh of resignation, calling Linshin an idiot, much to the other girl's annoyance. Ruby tells her that an adventurer's aim wasn't to fight. They aimed to survive while putting their lives on the line fighting monsters. It would be better for them if nobody got hurt. With a pleasant smile, Ruby turns back to Linshin and says that nothing made her happier than their current fight. Her words make Linshin freeze, a chill running down her spine. Although she looked conflicted, Linshin raises her sword and tells Ruby to save her words for after their fight was over. Ruby accepts the challenge. Silas was acting as their referee. On her mark, the fight starts and immediately Ruby is dashing towards Linshin. When Ruby is close enough, Linshin swings her sword down to strike, but Ruby speeds up at the last second and dodges the attack perfectly. Linshin swings again, and again Ruby dodges. Growing steadily angrier, Linshin yells for Ruby not to look down on her, but Ruby merely laughs. When she gets behind Linshin, she slides to a stop, pivots, and delivers a sharp kick to Linshin's back. Although Linshin was indeed used to sparring from her lessons, she simply couldn't keep up with Ruby's speed. It was obvious, especially as Linshin struggled back up to stand, but Ruby was already on her blind spot again. Ruby pulls back her arm and strikes Linshin multiple times in a succession of attacks. Linshin grits her teeth in anger, unable to defend in time. She summons her shield, but she is still too slow for Ruby. With a smile, Ruby summons her wind magic, urging it to blow towards Linshin. Too busy guarding against the wind attack, it leaves Linshin's side open to an attack. When Ruby appears beside her again, it dawns on her that she realized too late the wind was a distraction. Ruby delivers another harsh kick, this time aimed at Linshin's jaw. The pain echoes throughout Linshin's body. She drops to the ground, struggling to get up, but not long after she fully passes out. Ruby declares the fight over with a pleased smile. Luke and Miral smile, as well as Silas officially announces Ruby is that winner. Silas adds that Ruby and Linshin's rankings would change accordingly. Luke congratulates Ruby for a job well done as she happily trots on over to them. She leans her head towards him and purrs as he pets her. However, he suddenly stops, eyes staring straight ahead. Silas is surprised to see Luke walking over as she's checking over Linshin. She places a protective arm over Linshin before asking what Luke wanted. Luke tells her he just thought that he'd take her to the infirmary. Silas pauses before agreeing. As Silas leaves the arena, Luke summons Val to carry Linshin's unconscious body. He turns back to Meryl and Ruby and tells them that the group should part ways for the day. Both agree to do so. Time passes and Luke makes his way back to the school buildings. On his way to the infirmary, he holds up Linshin's body in front of him. Luke couldn't help but remember that before he reincarnated, Linshin was actually his favorite character. Although it was nice and all that her route ends in her becoming the ideal wife, the reason she was his favorite was how she acts in a different route. In that route, she loses against the original Luke and is forced to marry him. As the story progresses, the protagonist attacks Luke's base and defeats him. After the fight, the protagonist, Dan, would hold out his hand to Linshin, asking her to come back to him so they could live together again. Although a player would think that they'd be able to get Linshin back after Luke was dead, she would instead tell Dan that it was already too late. Linshin would say that Luke was her only family, much to Dan's shock. In the game, she passes by Dan completely and reaches out to Luke's severed head on the ground. Dan could only grit his teeth as from behind him, Linshin would clutch Luke's head close to her. In a shaky voice, she would say that Dan had killed her husband. Dan's hands shook as he held his sword. Meanwhile, Linshin would wordlessly stare at Luke's body before she let out a sad smile. She declares that she would never be Dan's, even if it killed her. Using her magic, she lights up a fire that completely swallows her body whole. However, the fire doesn't seem to bother her as she only cries for the dead Luke in her arms. Dan turns around in a panic as the room is lit aglow with the raging fire covering Linshin. He swears as he reaches out to her, but the fire burns even fiercer until he's unable to come any closer. Before Dan's very eyes, she was completely burned to ashes, which is very hardcore of her despite the very sad circumstances. Dan could only sob. He left the room alone, smoke trailing after him from inside the room. Linshin recognized whoever took her chastity as her husband and was fully devoted to him to the bitter end. Thinking of Linshin looking after the original Luke, from his tantrums to comforting him after in her arms, that pure and deep devotion was burned into the back of the current Luke's mind. A girl with such a pure soul that she would fully devote herself to her husband no matter who he was, made her the perfect useless husband machine. Even in another route, Linshin would only laugh and say that it couldn't be helped and her husband was useless without her, even though it seemed like she was the one making the man useless. Luke is knocked out of his thoughts and back into the present as someone calls out to him. It was Dan. He jogs up to them as he notices Linshin being held up by Val. Dan asks if Linshin lost and Luke agrees but clarifies that it wasn't to him. Dan is confused because as far as he knew, she had challenged him. Luke tells him that he refused and she fought Ruby instead. Luke couldn't help but think that this was the first time he had a proper conversation with Dan. He was on his guard, thinking Dan would come pouncing at him again, but he seemed completely calm. Luke comments on how unexpected things were. Dan is confused for a moment before realizing what he most likely meant. Awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck, he says that he felt like he's caused Luke a lot of trouble. Fully turning to Luke, he bows his head and apologizes. Luke remembered that the protagonist was more impulsive and hot-headed, so he couldn't help but wonder what he was up to. Luke lets out a humph and asks why Dan had a sudden change of heart. Dan clarifies that there was no real reason. He adds that Duke Descustos was still an enemy of the princess and he would still have to take Luke down one day, but he recognizes that he was different. He holds out a fist to Luke, eyes bright as he says that Luke was an amazing hard worker who was way ahead of everyone. Dan rubs the back of his head, saying that he wasn't the kind of detestable noble he thought Luke was. Meanwhile, Luke's mouth curls up at the corners. He jokes that even an idiot like Dan could learn, and Dan tells him to shut up. Handing Linshin over to Dan, Luke tells him that he was leaving her up to him. As Dan carries Linshin from Val and Luke calls back his magic, Dan says that Luke was his enemy but not quite a bad guy. With a pleasant smile, Dan says that Linshin could be pretty stubborn, and she had her position to worry about, so his words may not do anything, but he would ask her to refrain from charging at him. However, Luke couldn't help but think that Dan was being way too defenseless all of a sudden. He knew that he needed to draw a line. In a dark voice, Luke asks Dan if he really didn't think he was a bad guy. Glaring at him, Luke says that Dan didn't know anything about him. Summoning his magic to come out of him in waves, he glares down at Dan and calls him a plebeian. The force of his magic makes Dan wince, but he stands his ground. Luke is rather amazed that he could even endure the great pressure he was exuding at that moment. He tells Dan that he had guts. Luke calls back his magic and watches the almost terrified look on Dan's face. He wanted Dan to stay like that and to grow into a splendid protagonist. It was what was best for him too, after all. Luke begins to walk away, telling Dan not to get the wrong idea. He glances back at Dan and tells him that he was the laziest and most villainous noble of all and he shouldn't forget it. As Luke disappears into the distance, Dan watches him go, a scared look on his face and breathing hard. He lets out a short laugh. He couldn't help but find Luke incredible. Another day began and Silas stood before the class in a forest. Today they were starting with extracurricular lessons. Each team would spend 3 days in the dungeon starting now. They would have to secure everything from food to shelter, with the basics they've been taught. She informs them that the faculty would be on standby in the dungeon as well, but making them act outside of an emergency would count against their team, so they should try to refrain from calling them. With that, she wishes them good luck. Suddenly someone hesitantly calls out to Luke. He turns around to find Linshin. He couldn't help but think that although she had promised to not interfere with his way of fighting after the duel, she still randomly called out to him. However, Linshin just asks why he was completely unarmed and empty-handed. Instead of answering, Luke looks at her and points out that she had too much baggage. Linshin had come up fully equipped with a large backpack and in full armor. Linshin just tells him that women needed to be prepared since they needed a lot of stuff for 3 whole days. However, even if that was the case, he still thought that she had too much. Especially since Muriel grew up in an orphanage, and Ruby was an adventurer used to camping, so it was expected for them to carry little. Meanwhile, Linshin was a full-fledged young noble lady. Luke orders Ruby to sort out what Linshin had. As Ruby pounces on Linshin, almost like she's been ready her whole life to do it, Luke asks Muriel to fill Linshin in on all she needs to know about the dungeon. Muriel readily agrees. Luke quietly pulls out his pillow as he listens to them bicker, although one-sidedly. Linshin begs them to wait and listen to her, but both ignore her. Muriel begins to explain how to move through forests. Ruby, meanwhile, goes through each and every one of the stuff Linshin brought, telling her to stuff what she really needed and what she could fit in her pouch. Eventually, Linshin is worn down by both girls, whining about why things had to happen to her. As Ruby prepares to pounce on her again, she finally gives in and admits that she brought too much useless stuff. When she turns to Luke, who is lying down on his pillow, she still insists that he brought too little. She says that she wouldn't share any of her food with him. Luke couldn't help but wonder if she was worried about him because she looked so concerned. Linshin seemed to have forgotten that he had a pouch too. It was convenient for him, since it already had his clothes, food, and shelter. He tells her not to worry about him and they should try getting along for the next 3 days. Luke tells them that they should find somewhere to camp before it grows dark and the others quickly disperse. They make their way deeper into the forest, Muriel pulling Luke's pillow along with them. As Luke's reading, Linshin suddenly calls out to him. She admits that Dan told her that he started carrying her to the infirmary. Luke cuts in, saying that he ended up leaving it up to Dan in the end. She adds that Muriel told her that she was paying him back for something he did for her long ago, and Ruby, who was stronger than Linshin, says that Luke was even stronger than her. Luke agrees with a clipped answer. Linshin asks if he was training every waking moment or something similar, but Luke couldn't help but be bothered that she loved to talk too much. Luke snaps his book shut and says that he hated moving around and cuts their conversation short. They were finally entering the dungeon. He settles back into his pillow. He says that since they actually sacrificed their days off to get ready, he would be counting on them again as usual. Muriel, Linshin, and Ruby prepare themselves. They were about to begin their dungeon conquest. They're immediately thrown into battle. Muriel pulls her bow back before asking Ruby to handle what was in the bushes. Ruby dashes into action, reassuring her that she would go hunt it down. Later on, Ruby warns Linshin that one of the monsters was rather tough. Linshin reassures her that she could leave it to her. Sometime later, Linshin asks Muriel to take care of the airborne monsters for them, and Muriel aims her bow upwards. After the fight, Muriel waves her hand around, trying to shake off the strain of pulling on her bow. Linshin asks if she's okay, and Muriel happily reassures her, adding that since she was able to level up, she had no plans of dragging the rest of them down. Linshin tells her not to push herself too hard, and Muriel thanks her for her concern. Ruby then turns to face Luke and tells him that she recommended using the clearing they just found in the middle of the forest. Luke decides to use the place to set up camp. However, Linshin exclaims in disbelief to see the camp that Luke ended up setting up, which appeared to be more of a fully furnished home in the middle of the forest. Linshin looks around the area, steadily getting more horrified. The tent, or home more like, was set up with a dining area, bed, and even a sofa. Linshin exclaims that it was almost like Luke was just asking for someone to attack them with a tent like that. Luke tells her to keep quiet. The tent even came with a working shower booth. Luke tells her that since he spent a whole day outside, he wanted a shower and to sleep in an actual bed. After all, he had to take care of his body. Not only that, Iris had told him that it was the same way she camped for last year's test as well, so it was completely fine. Linshin imagines the scene completely dumbfounded. Luke begins to set up the dining table, telling Linshin to sit and eat already. Linshin tells him that she already had her own share of dried meat ready, but she's interrupted by the sound of clattering porcelain. She turns to Luke in shock. Linshin exclaims in disbelief again to find that Luke had prepared the dining table with luxurious food. Each seat had soybean pasta and soup with dried meat, vegetables, and mushrooms. Luke calmly tells her that it was Karen's cooking and she always took care of him. Lin-Shin is completely struck silent as Muriel and Ruby enter the tent. Luke says that since he had enough for all of them, they should all eat together. The party eventually all find themselves seated and digging into Karen's dishes. Muriel exclaims in delight, saying that it was even better than what they usually ate in the cafeteria. She praises Karen for her cooking. Ruby compliments it as well for being delicious and healthy at the same time, jokingly calling it cheating. Lin-Shin is quiet for a moment as she stares down at the spoonful of food. Eventually, she takes a bite and her eyes light up, just as pleased as the others that it was so good. Seeing her enjoy the meal, Luke smiles. After dinner, Luke does his usual nightly routine. He takes a shower before tending to his skincare, to which Muriel and Ruby watch in wonder. However, as Muriel and Ruby settle into bed and Luke does some yoga, Lin-Shin barges in and asks them who was going to keep watch for the night. She offers to take the first shift if the others planned on going to sleep at the same time. Luke falls back into bed as Muriel approaches Lin-Shin, saying that they didn't need to keep watch for the night. Muriel informs Lin-Shin that Luke could use magic while he was asleep. As such, no monsters could come within 30 meters of them. Lin-Shin flinches in shock. Peeking behind Muriel, Lin-Shin asks if Luke was already asleep. Luke doesn't respond, his eyes already closed. Suddenly, Muriel calls out to Lin-Shin by her title of princess. Lin-Shin asks about the honorific and Muriel explains that she was from the Marshall territory. Suddenly, Muriel leans closer and asks Lin-Shin why she so obviously disliked Luke the whole time they were together as a group. Lin-Shin looks away, saying that despite Luke sleeping in the room, he was still there with them. However, Luke was still very much awake. He just didn't bother opening his eyes. Muriel tells Lin-Shin that Luke never woke up before he had slept a certain amount of time. Unbeknownst to them, Luke would normally use his sleep skill to fall asleep in an instant. But since they were talking about how Lin-Shin felt about him, he was more interested in the conversation. Muriel urges Lin-Shin to tell her how she really felt. Lin-Shin is unsure for a moment, but then she agrees, saying that maybe talking about it would help set things in order. Ruby tells her that they would hear her out. However, Lin-Shin suddenly bows her head low. She wanted to apologize to Ruby and Muriel first for everything. Ruby asks why she was apologizing and Lin-Shin says it was for her attitude during the practical and for being arrogant. Ruby stretches, saying that if that was the case, then she accepted the apology. Muriel tells Lin-Shin to raise her head and reassures her that she accepted her apology as well. Lin-Shin stands up straight with a smile, happy with their answer. She says that since they were both her classmates and teammates, she wanted to get along with them. She tells them to call her by her first name. As they continue to talk, Luke turns around in bed, his back facing them. If it was a conversation between the girls to deepen their bond, then he found it crass if he decided to listen in. He turns on his sleep skill and slowly loses consciousness. The last thing in mind was how he was glad that the others seemed to get along. Time passes and dawn arrives. Luke stands outside the tent, just having finished his morning routine. His next training was simultaneous activation. He lets Val take control of his body once more. He was able to use more skills to his advantage ever since he started training. Control allowed him to remotely control Val, who in turn took control of his body. He could use Val to initiate a defense system and search the area to find anything that approached Luke with ill intent, intercepting it before it got close. He was able to send up multiple Vals in the sky to detect creatures within a 30-meter radius. With Search, he also had a skill called Map Sense, a sort of view of a map appearing over his eyes based on the Val's findings. Blue-marked creatures denoted no ill intent towards him. In that instant, it would be the girls currently resting inside the tent. Red marked enemies. Luke made sure that sleep was cast over them as soon as they were detected. Meanwhile, yellow markings meant the creature was wary of him. Using 3 spells at once meant intense mana consumption on his end, which was why he was training his mana control in the manner. It was almost like he was playing a video game with a new controller. However, suddenly the creature marked yellow on his map gave off a resounding beep in his head. Luke whipped his head around just as something came barreling towards him. At just the right moment, Luke's body kicked hard, sending the intruder's sword flying from their hold. It was Lin-Shin, and despite just being beaten again, she smiles in frustration and says that it was just as expected of Luke. Val leaves Luke's body, and Luke asks Lin-Shin if she was really planning on killing him. He warns her that no traces of her would ever be found if he decided to kill her in the dungeon. Lin-Shin picks up the sword from the ground and sheathes it back in place. She tells Luke that she just saw him when she woke up. He was showing off fierce martial arts while casting multiple spells. Lin-Shin found the spectacle incredible. She turns to him and asks if that was his true self. Annoyed, Luke breathes out a heavy sigh, asking what Lin-Shin was trying to do. Lin-Shin asks him to fight her, and Luke immediately gets more pissed, saying that that was the only thing Lin-Shin ever thought about. She says that she knew full well that what she was doing was stupid, but Dan had told her something once. He told her not to just take the rumors about Luke as gospel, and to instead judge him with her own 2 eyes. She also noticed one more thing. Nothing would change the fact that their families were enemies, but that didn't mean he had to be her enemy. Despite her kind words, Luke doesn't take nicely to it. First it was Dan, but now Lin-Shin had changed too. He didn't like that he would have less control if things strayed too far from the original story. If everything was all his fault for winning the first fight, then correcting the story's course should also be his task. Finally, Luke says that just that once he would be willing to fight her. Lin Shen is immediately ecstatic over the idea, but Luke has a condition. She was never allowed to challenge him to a fight ever again. Lin Shen doesn't mind and agrees to the condition without a second thought. Luke doesn't look too pleased about the situation. Luke asks what Lin Shen was hoping to gain by fighting him. She says she was willing to learn anything. Raising her sword, she says that she believed people could converse with their souls when they crossed blades. With a grin, she points her sword at him and says that she would come to understand Luke after the fight. Luke only frowns, calling her a battle maniac. Covering his face, Luke calls out for Val's support. However, he knew that if he used his attribute magic the way he always did, the fight would be over in an instant. He decided to engage in a conversation with Lin Shen for the moment. Lin Shen lets out a battle cry as she rushes up to Luke. She swings her sword at him, but Luke easily dodges. He dashes up to her, trying to grab and disarm her, but Lin Shen sees him in the corner of her vision. She quickly backs away just as Luke swipes at her. In an instant, Luke or Val recovers and dashes up to her again. Lin Shen throws her shield up just as Luke's body throws a direct punch at her. However, it's not enough, and the sheer strength of his attack sends her back. Luke holds out a hand free from any damage, preparing for another attack. Lin Shen grits her teeth in frustration as the fight continues. In the original game, the martial style was the greatest sword style, but with an amateur practitioner like Lin Shen, their movements became simple to read. As the fight carries on, Lin Shen is steadily growing more and more exhausted. Luke stands over her with an outstretched hand, hoping to end things quickly. However, in a last-ditch effort of winning, Lin Shen yells out and grabs at Luke's wrist. Much to Val's surprise, she pulls at him, but Luke's body is faster and he quickly tries to disarm her. In the process of their struggle, he ends up on top of her. Rather disgruntled by the fast movement, it takes a while for Lin Shen to realize what was happening. However, when she gathers her bearings, she realizes that Luke's lips are on hers. Well, so much for correcting the story's course, I guess. Luke pulls away and quickly gets back up. Lin Shen sits up, completely out of sorts. Luke kneels before her, but Lin Shen is quiet and her face is completely red. Back in his own body, Luke flicks her forehead, saying that he won. He walks away, annoyed and needing another shower. However, left behind on the clearing, Lin Shen muffles her embarrassed voice with her hand. Time passes and the morning arrives. Luke sets up their breakfast on the dining table. However, as he tastes the meal, he wipes away the remains from his lips and freezes. In the next second, he's back in bed. Muriel is rather surprised, asking if he was heading back to sleep. Luke tells them to go ahead and eat without him. It's around midday when Luke gets out of bed. Muriel greets him as he walks out of the tent with a yawn. He asks to be in their care again for the day, and Muriel happily agrees. However, her voice is quickly laced with concern as she says that something felt off about the forest. She couldn't seem to detect a single monster. Luke uses search and map skill to check, and just like she said, there were no enemy markers around them. Muriel was sure Luke knew something, but their conversation is quickly interrupted when someone runs in saying there was bad news. It was Lin Shen, announcing that a huge monster was fighting. Luke adds that the boss fight was most likely starting. When too many monsters are hunted in a dungeon, the dungeon would create a boss monster to eliminate the humans inside. In order to gather enough mana for the boss monster, all the small fry scatter and disappear. Lin Shen's panic over finding the monster is quickly wiped away by embarrassment at the sight of Luke. She turns away from him, even with her face flushed, and tries to talk about what happened. Annoyed, Luke quickly looks away and tells her not to get so worked up about an accidental kiss. At his words, Muriel and Ruby exclaim in shock. Lin Shen's face turns even more red as she realizes that they really did end up kissing. But Luke cuts her off and says that nobody cared and they got a boss to defeat. I mean, he's not wrong, but that's pretty cold-blooded for a reply. Luke orders Ruby to check out the spot he told her about. He tosses his magic pouch to Muriel, telling her to pack up the camp. Turning to Lin Shen, he asks where the boss was, and although still rather flustered, Lin Shen guides him into the forest. Lin Shen leads the way, but she's quickly distracted when Luke appears right beside her. She ends up forcing herself to run faster. Already realizing what she was doing and what was happening to her, Luke's face morphs into a conflicted expression. Lin Shen stops as she points to something in a clearing. It was a huge slime. At the sight of it, Luke groans. His face is morphed into disgust as he says that slimes in real life were just so gross. He was hoping that the boss would look cute since they were in a forest. The slime is suddenly engulfed in water and Luke realizes it was water. Turning to the side, he sees Libera casting the spell. With Dan taking the lead of his group, Luke sees that Team 1 was already engaged in combat with the boss. It was happening all according to the game. Luke holds out a hand and summons out Val. Floating into the air using his companion, Lin Shen calls out to him asking where he was going. Luke manages one glance at her, saying that he was going out to take a look.